The year 60 BC found the vast expanse of Gaul divided among dozens of Celtic tribes, each fiercely protective of their territorial boundaries and ancient traditions. This patchwork of tribal confederations stretched from the Rhine in the east to the Atlantic in the west, from the English Channel down to the Mediterranean shores already under Roman control. The political landscape resembled a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties that had persisted for generations, creating both opportunities and challenges for any external power seeking to influence the region. Among the most powerful tribal confederations, the Aedui controlled substantial territory in what is now Burgundy and the Upper Loire Valley. Their capital at Bibracte, perched atop Montbeuvray, commanded strategic routes through central Gaul and served as a major trading hub, where Mediterranean goods flowed northward in exchange for Celtic metalwork, amber, and slaves. The Aedui had cultivated a relationship with Rome dating back to the late 2nd century BC, earning recognition as friends and allies of the Roman people, a status that granted them certain privileges while subtly binding them to Roman interests. East of the Aedui, across the Saône River, the Sequani occupied the Jura Mountains and the fertile plains extending toward the Rhine. Their territory included crucial mountain passes that connected Gaul with the Germanic tribes beyond the Great River. The Sequani had grown increasingly resentful of Aeduan dominance in regional trade networks, and had begun seeking alternative alliances to challenge their rivals' position. This rivalry would prove particularly significant as both tribes competed for control over lucrative trade routes and the loyalty of smaller neighbouring communities. In the mountainous regions of the Massif Central, the Arverni maintained their ancestral holdings, despite their crushing defeat at the hands of the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus in 121 BC at the Battle of Vindalium. Though their power had been significantly reduced following this military disaster, the Arverni retained considerable influence among the tribes of central and western Gaul. Their capital at Gergovia occupied a naturally fortified position that commanded the surrounding valleys, and their warriors remained renowned throughout Gaul for their skill in combat and their fierce independence. The Helvetii, dwelling in the alpine regions of modern Switzerland, controlled mountain passes that connected Italy with northern Europe. Their territory encompassed fertile valleys where they practiced advanced agriculture alongside their traditional pastoral activities. By the middle of the 1st century BC, population pressure and the encroachment of Germanic tribes from the north had begun to strain Helvetian resources, leading to internal discussions about seeking new lands elsewhere in Gaul. These major tribal confederations existed alongside dozens of smaller tribes, each with their own distinct territories, customs, and political structures. The Belgae in the north, comprising tribes such as the Nervii, Ambiorix's Eburons, and the Remi, maintained a reputation as the fiercest warriors in all of Gaul. Their proximity to Germanic tribes across the Rhine had hardened them through constant warfare, creating a martial culture that valued courage above all other virtues. The Atlantic tribes, including the Veneti with their powerful naval forces, and the Santones who controlled important river mouths, had developed extensive maritime trading networks that connected Gaul with Britain and the Iberian Peninsula. Intertribal relationships fluctuated constantly based on territorial disputes, trade disagreements, and personal rivalries between chieftains. Marriage alliances between noble families could shift the balance of power overnight, while successful cattle raids or the discovery of new mineral deposits might spark conflicts that lasted for generations. The absence of any unified political authority meant that tribal assemblies made decisions through complex processes involving druids, warrior nobles, and sometimes broader councils of free men. Rome's presence in southern Gaul had been steadily expanding since the conquest of the Greek colony of Massilia's territories in 125 BC. The establishment of Gallia Narbonensis as a formal province created a buffer zone protecting Roman interests, while providing a launching point for further expansion northward. Narbo Martius, founded in 118 BC, quickly developed into a thriving commercial centre where Roman merchants, Gallic traders, and Mediterranean craftsmen mingled in bustling markets filled with goods from across the known world. The Roman road system in Narbonensis connected major settlements and military installations, facilitating the rapid movement of troops and supplies while encouraging economic development. The Via Domitia stretched from the Rhone to the Pyrenees, linking Roman territories in Gaul with those in Hispania and creating an efficient corridor for administrative and military communications. Roman engineers had constructed bridges across major rivers, established way stations for official travellers, and built harbours that could accommodate the largest merchant vessels of the era. Roman colonists and Italian businessmen had established themselves throughout the province, intermarrying with local elites and gradually introducing Roman legal concepts, architectural styles, and social customs. Native Gallic communities found themselves increasingly integrated into Roman economic networks, supplying raw materials and agricultural products in exchange for manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items from across the Mediterranean world. This process of cultural and economic integration created a model that Rome would later attempt to replicate throughout the rest of Gaul. The strategic importance of controlling Mediterranean trade routes had become increasingly apparent to Roman politicians and military commanders. Gallia Narbonensis provided secure overland connections between Roman territories in Hispania and Italy, reducing dependence on potentially dangerous sea routes during winter months. The province also served as a recruiting ground for auxiliary troops and a source of tribute that helped fund Roman military operations elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, Gaius Julius Caesar had reached a critical juncture in his political career. His consulship in 59 BCE had been marked by controversial legislation and bitter conflicts with his colleague Marcus Bibulus, earning him powerful enemies among the conservative senatorial faction. Caesar's alliance with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the arrangement that historians would later term the First Triumvirate, had provided him with the political muscle necessary to pass his legislation, but it had also committed him to supporting his partner's interests while advancing his own ambitious agenda. Caesar's financial situation in 59 BC bordered on desperate. His lavish spending on public games, building projects, and political bribes during his rise through the cursus honorum had accumulated enormous debts that threatened to destroy his career and possibly his life. Roman law provided harsh penalties for debtors, and Caesar's creditors included some of the wealthiest and most influential men in the Republic. Only a major military command offering opportunities for plunder and the systematic exploitation of conquered territories could generate the wealth necessary to resolve his financial crisis. The political benefits of military success were equally crucial to Caesar's long-term plans. Roman society valued military achievement above all other accomplishments, and successful generals could expect triumph parades, permanent fame, and the political capital necessary to reach the highest offices of state. Caesar had observed how Pompey's eastern conquests had elevated him to unprecedented prominence, and he recognized that similar achievements would be essential for his own advancement. The consulship had also provided Caesar with insight into the complex factional struggles that dominated Roman politics. The Optimates, led by figures such as Marcus Porcius Cato and Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, consistently opposed popularist politicians who appealed directly to the Roman people rather than working through traditional senatorial channels. Caesar's legislation benefiting Pompey's veterans and confirming his eastern territorial arrangements had intensified these factional conflicts, making it clear that Caesar would need substantial military resources to protect himself from future political attacks. Gallic society presented both opportunities and challenges for Roman intervention. The Druids wielded enormous influence as judges, teachers, and religious authorities throughout the Celtic world. These learned men memorized vast amounts of oral tradition, including legal precedents, genealogies, and sacred knowledge that bound Gallic communities together across tribal boundaries. Annual gatherings in the territory of the Carnutes allowed Druids from throughout Gaul to coordinate their activities and maintain consistency in their teachings and legal decisions. The Druidical system created networks of communication and authority, that transcended tribal boundaries, but it also represented a potential threat to Roman control. Druids taught that the soul was immortal and that death in battle was merely a transition to another form of existence. Beliefs that encouraged the fierce resistance Roman armies had encountered in previous Celtic conflicts. Their role as judges meant that they could influence legal decisions affecting Roman merchants and settlers, while their educational functions allowed them to shape the attitudes of young Gallic nobles toward Roman expansion. Gallic warrior aristocracy formed the backbone of tribal military forces and political leadership. These nobles maintained their status through success in warfare, generous hospitality, and the accumulation of clients who depended upon their protection and patronage. A successful war chief might command the loyalty of hundreds of armed followers, while also maintaining diplomatic relationships with nobles from other tribes through marriage alliances, shared military campaigns, or mutual assistance pacts. The institution of clientage permeated Gallic society at every level. Powerful nobles attracted clients through displays of wealth, military prowess, and the ability to provide protection during times of conflict. These relationships created complex webs of obligation and loyalty that could be manipulated by skilled politicians. A chieftain who could deliver the support of his clients to a particular cause might expect reciprocal assistance when his own interests were threatened. Common warriors sought to attach themselves to successful leaders who could provide them with opportunities for glory and plunder. Young men from aristocratic families served as companions to established war chiefs, learning the skills of leadership while proving their courage in battle. This system created strong personal bonds between leaders and followers, but it also meant that the death or defeat of a prominent chieftain could quickly unravel entire military coalitions. Gallic agricultural communities operated within this aristocratic framework, providing the economic foundation that supported warrior elites and their military activities. Skilled craftsmen produced the weapons, jewelry, and luxury goods that marked social status, while farmers and herders generated the surplus wealth that allowed nobles to maintain their followers and engage in the competitive displays of generosity that marked Celtic culture. Trade relationships connected Gallic communities with the broader European economy, bringing Mediterranean wines, Roman manufactured goods, and exotic materials from distant regions in exchange for Celtic metalwork, agricultural products, and slaves captured in warfare. These commercial networks created additional opportunities for ambitious leaders to accumulate wealth and influence, while also providing channels through which Roman political and cultural influences could penetrate Gallic society. The complex interplay of tribal politics, economic interests, and cultural traditions had created a situation where Gaul remained politically fragmented despite sharing common languages, religious practices, and social structures. This fragmentation would prove crucial to Roman success, as it prevented the formation of unified resistance, while providing opportunities for divide and conquer strategies that could turn Gallic tribes against one another in pursuit of Roman objectives. Against this backdrop of tribal complexity and Roman ambition, the crisis that would launch Caesar's conquest of Gaul emerged from the mountains of Helvetian territory in early 58 BC. The Helvetii, occupying the plateau between Lake Geneva and the Rhine, had spent years deliberating a momentous decision that would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. Their tribal assembly, meeting in the shadow of alpine peaks that had sheltered their ancestors for generations, voted to abandon their ancestral homeland entirely and seek new territories in the fertile plains of Western Gaul. The scale of this planned migration defied all previous Celtic population movements. According to records later captured by Roman forces, the Helvetii had conducted a systematic census revealing that their migration would involve approximately 368,000 individuals: men, women, children, elderly, and slaves, along with countless livestock and the accumulated material wealth of generations. This massive undertaking represented not merely a tribal relocation, but the movement of an entire civilization, complete with its social structures, religious practices, and economic systems. The driving forces behind this unprecedented decision reflected mounting pressures that had been building for decades. Germanic tribes, particularly the Cimbri and Teutones, whose earlier migrations had terrorized Roman territories, continued pressing southward from their traditional lands beyond the Rhine. These Germanic incursions had gradually reduced Helvetian territory, forcing the tribe to abandon outlying settlements and concentrate their population in increasingly cramped mountain valleys. Simultaneously, population growth had strained the carrying capacity of their alpine environment, where harsh winters, limited agricultural productivity and pasture lands could support only finite numbers of cattle and sheep. The Helvetii had identified the territory of the Santones along the Atlantic coast near modern Bordeaux as their intended destination. This region offered fertile agricultural lands, access to maritime trade networks, and sufficient space to accommodate their entire population. The route they planned would take them through the territories of multiple Gallic tribes, creating a corridor of disruption that would inevitably affect established trade relationships, territorial boundaries, and political alliances throughout the region. Vercingetorix, the most prominent noble among the Helvetii, had emerged as the primary architect of this migration plan. His wealth, accumulated through successful cattle-raising operations and strategic marriages with noble families from neighbouring tribes, provided him with the resources necessary to organise such a massive undertaking. Vercingetorix had spent considerable time building support for the migration among tribal leaders, arguing that their current territory offered no long-term security against Germanic expansion, and that boldness in seeking new lands would restore Helvetian prestige among the Celtic peoples. The logistical preparations required for moving 368,000 people across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory demanded extraordinary organisational capabilities. The Helvetii began accumulating supplies of grain, preserved meat, and other provisions that could sustain their population during the months-long journey. They constructed thousands of wagons to transport their possessions, elderly individuals, and young children who could not endure the rigours of walking such distances. Craftsmen worked continuously to produce additional weapons, tools, and equipment that would be essential for establishing their new settlement. Most dramatically, the Helvetii made the irreversible decision to burn their existing settlements, destroying their homes, granaries, and all infrastructure that could not be transported. This deliberate destruction served multiple purposes. It prevented any possibility of retreat that might weaken resolve during difficult moments of the journey. It denied their territories to Germanic tribes who might otherwise occupy abandoned Helvetian lands, and it demonstrated to neighbouring peoples the absolute commitment of the Helvetii to their migration plan. The smoke from burning settlements rose throughout Helvetian territory during the spring of 58 BC, visible from great distances and serving as an unmistakable signal that one of Gaul's most established tribes had chosen to abandon everything familiar in pursuit of an uncertain future. The psychological impact of this destruction extended far beyond Helvetian borders, as neighbouring tribes recognised that such desperate measures indicated both the severity of Germanic pressure and the potential for massive disruption throughout the region. Caesar, recently arrived in his province of Gallia Narbonensis to assume his proconsular duties, received reports of Helvetian preparations through his network of informants and allied tribal leaders. The intelligence reaching him described not merely another Celtic tribal migration, but a movement of unprecedented scale that threatened to destabilise the entire regional balance of power. The proposed Helvetian route would take them through territories of tribes allied to Rome, creating obligations for intervention based on existing treaty relationships. The immediate strategic threat posed by the Helvetian migration became apparent as Caesar analysed their intended path. The most direct route from Helvetian territory to the lands of the Santones led through the narrow passage between Lake Geneva and the Jura Mountains, then across the Rhone River near the Roman settlement at Geneva. This route would bring the entire Helvetian population, along with their armed warriors, directly through Roman-controlled territory and into the lands of the Allobroges, who had been defeated by Roman forces in 121 BC and remained under Roman authority. Caesar recognised that allowing such a massive armed migration through Roman territory would establish a dangerous precedent, potentially encouraging other tribes to attempt similar movements while demonstrating Roman inability to control events within their own provincial boundaries. The migration would also disrupt established trade relationships, territorial arrangements, and political alliances that Rome had carefully cultivated over decades of diplomatic activity in the region. The proconsul's response demonstrated both the rapid decision-making capabilities that would characterize his entire Gallic campaign and his understanding of the strategic principles necessary for maintaining Roman authority. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the Helvetii or seeking diplomatic solutions that might allow their migration to proceed through alternative routes, Caesar chose immediate military intervention designed to prevent the migration entirely. Caesar's first action involved the destruction of the bridge over the Rhone at Geneva, eliminating the most convenient crossing point for the Helvetian migration. Roman engineers, working under military protection, systematically dismantled the stone and wooden structures that had facilitated trade and communication between Roman territories and the lands beyond the Rhone. This destruction served both practical and symbolic purposes. It physically blocked the Helvetian route, while demonstrating Roman determination to prevent unauthorized movements through their territory. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered the construction of extensive fortifications along the Rhone River, creating a defensive barrier that extended for 19 miles from Lake Geneva to the Jura Mountains. These fortifications included earthworks, palisades, and defensive positions that could be manned by relatively small numbers of Roman troops, while preventing large-scale crossings by Helvetian forces. The construction project required enormous amounts of labour, materials and coordination, but it established a clear physical manifestation of Roman territorial authority. The speed with which these defensive measures were implemented caught the Helvetii unprepared for such decisive Roman intervention. Their migration plans had assumed that Roman authorities would either ignore their movement or attempt to negotiate passage terms that might prove acceptable to both parties. Instead, they found themselves confronted with unmistakable evidence of Roman determination to prevent their migration entirely. Caesar justified his intervention through carefully crafted diplomatic communications that emphasized his obligations to protect Roman allies and maintain regional stability. He dispatched envoys to tribal leaders throughout Gaul, explaining that the Helvetian migration threatened established territorial boundaries and trade relationships that benefited all peaceful tribes in the region. These communications portrayed Roman intervention as a defensive measure designed to preserve order, rather than an aggressive expansion of Roman authority. The Helvetii, faced with the impossibility of crossing the Rhone at Geneva, sought alternative routes that might allow their migration to proceed. They opened negotiations with the Sequani, whose territory included mountain passes that could provide access to western Gaul without crossing Roman-controlled lands. These negotiations involved complex discussions about compensation for passage rights, guarantees of peaceful behaviour during transit, and arrangements for supplying the massive Helvetian population during their journey through Sequani territory. The Sequani leadership found themselves in an extremely difficult position, caught between their desire to avoid involvement in a conflict with Rome and their recognition that refusing Helvetian requests might result in armed conflict with a desperate population of nearly 400,000 people. Internal debates within Sequani councils reflected broader uncertainties about Roman intentions and the potential consequences of various responses to the developing crisis. During these negotiations, the Helvetii also sought support from other Gallic tribes who might benefit from challenging Roman authority, or who shared concerns about Germanic expansion. They dispatched envoys to the Tigurini, a tribe that had historical grievances against Rome dating back to their participation in the Cimbrian Wars, and to various smaller tribes whose territories lay along potential migration routes. The Tigurini, remembering their ancestors' victories over Roman armies during the late 2nd century BC, agreed to join the Helvetian migration. Their decision added approximately 36,000 additional people to the migration, along with experienced warriors who had maintained military traditions from the era of Germanic invasions. This alliance strengthened Helvetian military capabilities while creating additional complications for Roman strategic planning. Caesar, monitoring these developments through his intelligence network, recognized that the crisis was expanding beyond a simple tribal migration into a broader challenge to Roman authority in Gaul. The involvement of the Tigurini and the negotiations with the Sequani indicated that the Helvetii were successfully building a coalition that might encourage other tribes to question Roman dominance in the region. The proconsul responded by accelerating his military preparations, summoning additional legions from their winter quarters and establishing supply lines that could support extended military operations. He also intensified his diplomatic efforts, sending representatives to tribal leaders throughout Gaul to reinforce Roman alliance relationships and discourage support for the Helvetian migration. The Sequani eventually agreed to allow Helvetian passage through their territory, a decision that reflected both their fear of Helvetian military capabilities and their calculation that supporting the migration might weaken their rivals, the Aedui, who controlled competing trade routes through central Gaul. This agreement provided the Helvetii with the alternative route they needed, but it also guaranteed Roman military intervention to prevent what Caesar now characterized as an invasion of Roman allied territory. The massive Helvetian migration began moving in late spring 58 BC, creating a spectacle unlike anything previously witnessed in Celtic Europe. The column of people, animals and wagons stretched for miles across the landscape, requiring careful coordination to maintain order and security during the journey. Helvetian warriors provided protection for the civilian population, while scouts ranged ahead to identify potential threats and suitable camping locations. As the migration entered Sequani territory and began moving toward the lands of the Aedui, Caesar launched his military response. He had assembled a force that included not only Roman legions, but also cavalry units provided by Gallic tribes allied to Rome, creating a combined army capable of rapid movement and flexible tactical responses. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the Helvetian migration, but also the future of Roman authority throughout Gaul. The Battle of Bibracte, fought near the Aeduan capital, would demonstrate Caesar's tactical innovations and establish the military principles that would guide his conquest of Gaul. The engagement began when Caesar's forces intercepted the Helvetian migration as it approached Aeduan territory, forcing a decisive confrontation that neither side could avoid. The Helvetii, committed to their migration and unable to retreat to their burned homeland, had no choice but to fight for their survival and their dreams of new territories in western Gaul. The decisive victory at Bibracte had barely concluded when Caesar faced intelligence reports that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the threats confronting Roman Gaul. While Helvetian survivors struggled northward toward their devastated homeland, carrying news of Roman military superiority to every tribe they encountered, a far more complex and potentially dangerous situation was unfolding along the Rhine frontier. Germanic tribes, led by their formidable king Ariovistus, had been steadily expanding westward across the Great River, establishing permanent settlements in Sequani territory and fundamentally disrupting the traditional balance of power that had maintained relative stability in eastern Gaul for generations. Ariovistus commanded not merely a single tribe, but a confederation of Germanic peoples including the Harudes Marcomanni, Tribuci, Vangiones, Nemetes, Seuducia, and Suebi. These groups had been gradually coalescing under his leadership since approximately 72 BC, when he first led substantial Germanic forces across the Rhine in response to Sequani requests for military assistance against their rivals, the Aedui. What had begun as a mercenary arrangement had evolved into something far more threatening to Roman interests: the systematic colonization of Gallic territory by Germanic peoples who recognized no Roman authority and maintained their own distinct cultural and political traditions. The scale of Germanic settlement had grown alarmingly by 58 BC. Roman intelligence sources, including merchants who travelled the Rhine trade routes, and Gallic nobles with territories near the Germanic settlements reported that approximately 120,000 Germanic settlers had established themselves in Sequani lands. These were not temporary military camps or seasonal raiding bases, but permanent agricultural communities complete with families, livestock, and the full apparatus of Germanic society transplanted across the Rhine. The settlers had constructed fortified villages, cleared forest lands for cultivation, and established their own legal and administrative systems that operated independently of existing Gallic tribal structures. The Germanic expansion had achieved its most dramatic success at the Battle of Magetobriga, fought approximately 3 years earlier in 61 BC. This engagement had pitted Ariovistus and his Germanic warriors alongside Sequani forces against a coalition led by the Aedui and their allies. The battle's outcome had shattered Aeduan military power in the region, killing or capturing many of their most experienced war leaders and forcing the survivors to acknowledge Germanic dominance over territories they had controlled for generations. The psychological impact of this defeat had reverberated throughout eastern Gaul, convincing many smaller tribes that accommodation with Germanic power offered better prospects for survival than continued resistance. Following their victory at Magetobriga, the Germanic settlers had systematically expanded their territorial control. They occupied the most fertile agricultural lands in Sequani territory, forcing the original inhabitants to relocate to marginal areas or accept subordinate status within the new Germanic political order. Ariovistus had established his primary residence at Vercingetorix, the principal Sequani settlement, transforming this strategic location into the administrative centre of his expanding domain. From Vercingetorix, Germanic authority extended along the Rhine Valley and westward into the heart of what had traditionally been Gallic territory. The implications of Germanic expansion extended far beyond simple territorial conquest. Ariovistus had begun demanding hostages from Gallic tribes throughout the region, a practice that effectively extended his political influence over communities that remained nominally independent. These hostages, typically the children of prominent nobles, served both as guarantees of tribal compliance with Germanic demands and as instruments for cultural transformation. Young Gallic aristocrats raised in Germanic households absorbed Germanic values, languages, and political concepts that they would carry back to their own tribes upon reaching adulthood. The economic disruption caused by Germanic settlement had fundamentally altered trade patterns throughout eastern Gaul. Traditional commercial relationships between Gallic tribes and Mediterranean merchants had been severed or redirected just through Germanic-controlled territories, where Ariovistus imposed his own taxation systems and trade regulations. Germanic settlers showed little interest in maintaining the sophisticated commercial networks that had connected Gallic producers with Roman markets, preferring instead to focus on subsistence agriculture and local exchange systems that reflected their own cultural preferences. Caesar received detailed reports about the Germanic situation from multiple sources, including formal embassies from the Aedui and Sequani, who sought Roman intervention to restore the previous territorial arrangements. The Aedui, still reeling from their defeat at Magetobriga, emphasized their status as friends and allies of Rome, while describing the growing Germanic threat to all Gallic peoples. The envoys painted vivid pictures of Germanic brutality, describing forced population transfers, the destruction of sacred groves, and the imposition of alien legal systems that violated fundamental Gallic customs and religious practices. The Sequani delegation presented a more complex narrative that reflected their tribe's difficult position as both Germanic allies and victims of Germanic expansion. While acknowledging that they had initially invited Ariovistus to assist them against the Aedui, Sequani representatives explained that Germanic settlement had grown far beyond anything they had anticipated or desired. They described how Germanic demands for land, resources, and political submission had gradually transformed their tribal territory into something resembling a Germanic kingdom where Sequani voices carried little weight in important decisions. These diplomatic communications reached Caesar during his consolidation of victory over the Helvetii, adding urgency to his strategic planning for the remainder of the campaigning season. The Germanic presence represented a qualitatively different challenge from the Helvetian migration crisis. While the Helvetii had sought to pass through Roman-influenced territories to reach distant lands, Ariovistus had established a permanent power base that directly challenged Roman authority over peoples who had formally acknowledged Roman friendship and alliance. The strategic implications of allowing Germanic expansion to continue unchecked were immediately apparent to Caesar. If Ariovistus succeeded in consolidating his control over Sequani territory and extending his influence over neighbouring tribes, the Rhine would cease to function as a meaningful barrier between the Germanic and Roman spheres of influence. Instead, Germanic power would be firmly established on the western bank of the river, providing a launching point for further expansion into central and southern Gaul that could eventually threaten Roman territorial integrity. Caesar's analysis of the situation was complicated by the fact that Ariovistus held formal recognition from the Roman Senate as a king and friend of the Roman people, a status granted during his consulship in 59 BC as part of broader diplomatic arrangements with various foreign rulers. This recognition had been intended to encourage Ariovistus to maintain peaceful relationships with Roman allies while containing his activities within acceptable boundaries. Instead, the Germanic king had interpreted Roman recognition as authorization for unlimited expansion, using his official status to legitimize conquests that directly contradicted Roman strategic interests. The proconsul's response to the Germanic crisis demonstrated the same decisiveness that had characterized his intervention against the Helvetii, but the diplomatic complexities surrounding Ariovistus required a more nuanced approach. Caesar could not simply launch immediate military operations against a ruler who held formal Roman recognition without first attempting diplomatic solutions that might resolve the crisis without warfare. Such attempts would also provide legal justification for military action if diplomatic efforts failed to produce acceptable results. Caesar dispatched envoys to Ariovistus with carefully crafted messages that acknowledged the Germanic king's official status while firmly establishing Roman expectations regarding his future behaviour. The Roman position demanded that Ariovistus cease further settlement of Germanic peoples in Gallic territory, return hostages taken from Roman allies, and refrain from attacking tribes that enjoyed Roman friendship and protection. These demands were presented not as ultimatums, but as reasonable expectations based on existing diplomatic relationships and mutual interests in maintaining regional stability. Ariovistus's response revealed both his confidence in Germanic military capabilities and his fundamental misunderstanding of Roman political culture. The Germanic king acknowledged Caesar's authority within Roman territorial boundaries while asserting his own right to govern territories conquered through legitimate warfare. He pointed out that his victories over the Aedui and their allies had been achieved through superior military skill and courage, creating rights of conquest that no external authority could legitimately challenge. His message emphasized that Germanic warriors had earned their lands through battle, just as Romans had earned their territories through military conquest. The Germanic king's response also revealed his sophisticated understanding of Roman political divisions and his belief that Caesar lacked sufficient authority to enforce demands that contradicted previous Roman diplomatic arrangements. Ariovistus reminded Caesar that the Roman Senate had formally recognized his royal status and had made no previous objections to Germanic settlement in Sequani territory. He suggested that Caesar's demands reflected personal ambition rather than official Roman policy, implying that other Roman leaders might take different positions regarding Germanic activities in Gaul. This diplomatic exchange occurred while both leaders were making military preparations that suggested neither expected negotiations to resolve their fundamental disagreements. Caesar had been concentrating his legions and gathering intelligence about Germanic military capabilities, while Ariovistus had been summoning additional warriors from beyond the Rhine and consolidating his control over strategic positions throughout his territory. The build-up of military forces on both sides created an atmosphere of tension that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The location chosen for face-to-face negotiations between Caesar and Ariovistus reflected the strategic importance both leaders placed on controlling the narrative of their conflict. They agreed to meet near Vercingetorix, the former Sequani capital that had become the centre of Germanic power in the region. This location provided Ariovistus with the psychological advantage of meeting on his own territory while allowing Caesar to demonstrate Roman willingness to engage in direct diplomacy even in potentially dangerous circumstances. Caesar's journey to Vercingetorix provided him with first-hand observation of Germanic settlement patterns and military preparations. The Roman proconsul could see the extent to which Germanic communities had transformed the landscape, replacing traditional Gallic agricultural practices with their own farming methods and constructing fortified positions that reflected Germanic defensive concepts. The visible prosperity of Germanic settlements, supported by tribute from subordinated Gallic communities, demonstrated the economic foundation that supported Ariovistus's expanding power. The negotiations themselves took place in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and careful protocol designed to avoid any appearance of weakness or submission by either party. Both leaders arrived with substantial military escorts, creating a tense environment where any misunderstanding or perceived insult might trigger immediate violence. The formal diplomatic procedures reflected the importance both sides placed on the outcome, while acknowledging the fundamental incompatibility of their respective positions. Ariovistus presented his case with the confidence of a ruler who had achieved remarkable success through military skill and political acumen. He emphasized that Germanic settlement in Gallic territory represented a natural expansion of stronger peoples into lands previously held by weaker tribes, a process that Romans themselves had employed throughout their conquest of the Mediterranean world. The Germanic king argued that his victories over the Aedui and other Gallic tribes had been achieved through legitimate warfare, creating rights of conquest that deserved the same recognition Romans claimed for their own territorial acquisitions. The Germanic position also included sophisticated arguments about the legal and political basis for their expansion. Ariovistus pointed out that the Sequani had formally invited Germanic assistance against their enemies, creating contractual obligations that justified continued Germanic presence in their territory. He argued that subsequent Germanic settlement represented compensation for military services rendered, a practice that aligned with both Germanic and Roman concepts of military reward and territorial acquisition. Caesar's response demonstrated his understanding that the negotiations represented not merely a discussion between individual leaders, but a fundamental confrontation between competing visions of political authority in Gaul. The Roman proconsul emphasized that Germanic expansion threatened the stability of relationships that Rome had carefully cultivated with Gallic tribes over many decades. He argued that continued Germanic settlement would inevitably lead to further conflicts that could destabilize the entire region, potentially threatening Roman territorial interests and commercial relationships. The Roman position also addressed the broader strategic implications of Germanic expansion beyond the immediate territorial disputes. Caesar warned that allowing unlimited Germanic settlement west of the Rhine would encourage additional migrations that could overwhelm Gallic resistance and create a massive Germanic presence that would threaten Roman security for generations. He emphasized that Roman intervention was necessary not only to protect existing allies, but also to maintain the Rhine as a stable frontier between the Germanic and Roman spheres of influence. The failure of these negotiations to produce any meaningful compromise reflected the fundamental incompatibility of Roman and Germanic strategic objectives in the region. Ariovistus remained committed to expanding Germanic settlement and political control, viewing Roman demands as unjustified interference in matters that fell within his legitimate sphere of authority. Caesar recognized that Germanic expansion posed an unacceptable threat to Roman interests that could not be resolved through diplomatic accommodation or territorial concessions. As the diplomatic meetings concluded without agreement, both leaders began final preparations for military confrontation that would determine the future of Germanic power in Gaul and establish the Rhine as either a meaningful frontier or merely another river within an expanding Germanic domain. The conclusion of the Ariovistus campaign had established Roman dominance over eastern Gaul and secured the Rhine as a meaningful frontier against Germanic expansion, but Caesar's intelligence network soon brought disturbing reports from the northern territories beyond Aeduan and Sequani lands. Throughout the winter of 58-57 BC, as Roman legions established winter quarters and consolidated their control over recently conquered territories, tribal envoys and merchant informants carried increasingly alarming news about developments among the Belgae, the confederation of tribes occupying the lands between the Seine and Rhine rivers that stretched northward to the shores of the North Sea. The Belgae had watched Roman victories over the Helvetii and Ariovistus with growing alarm, recognizing that Caesar's systematic elimination of major threats to Roman authority would inevitably bring Roman attention to their own territories. Unlike the southern Gallic tribes who had maintained various degrees of diplomatic contact with Roman authorities over several decades, the Belgae had remained largely isolated from Roman political influence, maintaining their traditional warrior culture and tribal independence while developing reputations as the fiercest fighters in all of Gaul. Their proximity to Germanic tribes across the Rhine had subjected them to constant warfare that had hardened their military capabilities and created a martial society that valued courage and military skill above all other virtues. The Belgae Confederation encompassed dozens of individual tribes, each maintaining distinct territorial boundaries and political structures while sharing common cultural traditions, religious practices, and military customs. The Nervii, occupying territories along the Scheldt River, had earned particular renown for their rejection of Mediterranean luxuries and their maintenance of primitive warrior traditions that emphasized physical toughness and combat effectiveness. The Ambiorix's Eburones controlled strategic positions along the Rhine that provided them with intimate knowledge of Germanic military methods and access to Germanic allies when circumstances required external support. The Remi, positioned closest to Roman-controlled territories, had developed more sophisticated political institutions and maintained limited trading relationships with Roman merchants, giving them better intelligence about Roman military capabilities and strategic intentions. The formation of the Belgae Confederation in response to Roman expansion represented an unprecedented level of political cooperation among tribes that had historically maintained fierce independence and frequent conflicts with their neighbours. Tribal assemblies throughout Belgae territory had sent representatives to coordinate their response to the Roman threat, creating military alliances and resource-sharing agreements that transcended traditional territorial boundaries and ancestral rivalries. These negotiations had required complex diplomatic arrangements involving marriage alliances, hostage exchanges, and carefully negotiated command structures that could accommodate the pride and traditions of multiple tribal leaderships. The Confederation's military preparations during the winter of 58-57 BC demonstrated both the scale of their commitment to resisting Roman expansion and their sophisticated understanding of the challenges they would face. Belgae smiths worked continuously throughout the cold months to produce additional weapons, armour, and military equipment, while tribal leaders organised supply systems capable of supporting large armies in the field for extended periods. The Confederation had also dispatched envoys beyond the Rhine to seek Germanic allies who might provide additional warriors or create diversionary attacks that could complicate Roman strategic planning. Caesar received detailed intelligence about Belgae preparations through multiple sources, including merchants who traded along the northern routes, Gallic nobles with family connections among Belgae tribes, and Roman agents who had been carefully cultivating informants throughout the region. These reports described not merely another tribal uprising, but a coordinated resistance movement that potentially commanded military resources exceeding anything Rome had previously encountered in Gaul. Roman estimates suggested that the Belgae Confederation could field over 300,000 warriors, a force that would outnumber Roman legions by more than 10 to 1 and pose unprecedented challenges for traditional Roman tactical approaches. The strategic importance of Belgae territory extended far beyond simple questions of territorial control or tribal submission. The region controlled crucial trade routes connecting the Rhine Valley with Atlantic ports, providing access to British tin, Germanic amber, and other valuable commodities that supported extensive commercial networks throughout northern Europe. Belgae territories also included fertile agricultural lands capable of supporting large populations and generating substantial tribute revenues, while their position along the North Sea coast offered potential naval bases that could support future Roman operations against British tribes or Germanic coastal peoples. The Confederation's reputation for military excellence was based on generations of warfare against Germanic tribes, internal conflicts between Belgae communities, and successful resistance to previous Roman diplomatic and military pressures. Belgae warriors maintained traditional Celtic fighting methods that emphasized individual courage and skill while adapting Germanic tactical innovations learned through constant contact with tribes beyond the Rhine. Their weapons included longswords designed for slashing attacks, heavy spears suitable for both throwing and thrusting, and large shields that provided excellent protection while maintaining mobility in combat. Caesar's response to the Belgae threat demonstrated his growing confidence in Roman military superiority and his understanding that decisive action early in the campaigning season could prevent the Confederation from fully mobilizing their enormous potential military resources. Rather than waiting for Belgae forces to complete their preparations and potentially take the initiative by attacking Roman allies or territories, the proconsul chose to launch preemptive operations designed to fragment the Confederation before it could achieve full military coordination. The Roman advance into Belgae territory began in early spring 57 BC, as soon as weather conditions permitted large-scale military movements. Caesar had assembled a force that included not only his veteran legions, but also substantial cavalry units provided by Gallic tribes allied to Rome, creating a combined army capable of rapid movement across the varied terrain of northern Gaul. The logistical preparations for this campaign required enormous quantities of supplies, equipment, and transport animals, as Roman forces would be operating far from their established supply bases in territories where local populations might deny them access to food, fodder, and other essential resources. The initial Roman advance encountered limited resistance as Caesar's forces moved through the territories of tribes that had not yet fully committed to the Belgae Confederation. Some smaller communities chose to submit immediately upon the appearance of Roman armies, calculating that early surrender offered better prospects for favourable treatment than prolonged resistance that might result in total destruction. These submissions provided Caesar with valuable intelligence about Belgae military preparations, while demonstrating to other tribes that Roman victory was inevitable and that cooperation offered better alternatives than futile resistance. The first major test of Roman capabilities against Belgae resistance occurred at the fortress of Bibrax, a strongly fortified position belonging to the Remi that came under siege by Confederation forces seeking to punish the tribe for their negotiations with Roman authorities. The siege of Bibrax provided Caesar with his first opportunity to observe Belgae military methods in action, while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities and tactical flexibility in responding to unexpected developments in hostile territory. The Belga siege of Bibrax employed traditional Celtic assault methods that relied on overwhelming numerical superiority and the fierce courage of individual warriors to overcome defensive positions. Confederation forces surrounded the fortress with massive earthworks designed to prevent relief efforts while constructing siege engines and assault towers that could bring attackers to the level of the defensive walls. The scale of these operations reflected both the military resources available to the Confederation and their determination to make examples of tribes that chose Roman alliance over Belgae solidarity. Caesar's relief of Bibrax demonstrated innovative approaches to siege warfare that would become characteristic of his entire Gallic campaign. Rather than attempting direct assault on Belgae siege positions, Roman forces constructed their own fortified camps at strategic distances from the fortress, creating secure bases that could support extended operations while threatening Belgae supply lines and communication networks. Roman engineers worked with remarkable speed to construct these defensive positions, employing techniques that had been refined through decades of military experience in diverse geographical and tactical environments. The Roman fortified camps at Bibrax incorporated sophisticated defensive features that reflected Caesar's understanding of both traditional Roman military engineering and the specific challenges posed by Belgae tactical methods. The camps included multiple lines of earthworks, carefully positioned obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, and internal layouts that facilitated rapid deployment of troops to threatened sectors. These defensive arrangements allowed relatively small Roman forces to withstand attacks by much larger numbers of enemies while maintaining the flexibility necessary for offensive operations when circumstances permitted. The coordination of multiple legions across the challenging terrain of northern Gaul required logistical capabilities that demonstrated the sophistication of Roman military administration. Caesar's supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory, requiring constant protection from raiding parties while maintaining the regular delivery of food, weapons, medical supplies and replacement equipment essential for sustained military operations. Roman quartermasters had established depot systems that could support armies operating far from traditional supply bases, while adapting to local conditions that differed significantly from Mediterranean environments where Roman logistics had been developed. The Belgae response to Roman relief operations at Bibrax revealed both the strengths and limitations of their military system. Confederation forces demonstrated remarkable courage and determination in their attacks on Roman positions, launching repeated assaults that tested every aspect of Roman defensive preparations. Individual Belgae warriors showed exceptional skill with traditional weapons while maintaining the fierce fighting spirit that had earned them reputation throughout the Celtic world. However, their tactical coordination remained limited by traditional Celtic military customs that emphasized individual heroism over disciplined unit actions. The failure of Belgae forces to prevent Roman relief of Bibrax marked the beginning of Confederation military difficulties that would ultimately lead to their defeat. The psychological impact of this failure spread throughout Belgae territories, raising questions about the Confederation's ability to resist Roman military capabilities and encouraging some tribes to reconsider their commitment to continued resistance. The successful Roman relief operations also demonstrated to neutral tribes throughout northern Gaul that Roman promises of protection for their allies carried genuine military backing. As Roman forces consolidated their position around Bibrax and prepared for further operations against Confederation strongholds, Caesar received intelligence reports indicating that Belgae leaders were reconsidering their strategic options in light of Roman military effectiveness. Some tribes within the Confederation had begun secret negotiations aimed at securing favourable surrender terms, while others advocated for more aggressive tactics that might exploit Roman vulnerabilities before their military advantages could become decisive. These internal divisions within the Confederation would prove crucial to Roman success in the broader campaign that was now developing across the breadth of Belgae territory. The fragmentation of the Belgae Confederation, following their defeats at Bibrax and subsequent engagements, had established Roman dominance over the northern territories of Gaul, but Caesar's intelligence network soon brought reports of a different nature of resistance emerging from the western reaches of the continent. Along the rugged Atlantic coastline of Armorica, in the peninsula that would later be known as Brittany, the maritime tribes had been observing Roman expansion with growing concern while simultaneously recognizing that the unique geographical position and naval capabilities offered defensive advantages unavailable to their inland neighbours. The Veneti, masters of the treacherous waters surrounding their coastal strongholds, had begun coordinating resistance efforts that would challenge Roman military doctrine in ways no previous Gallic campaign had demanded. The Veneti occupied a network of coastal settlements and offshore islands that provided them with natural defensive positions, while supporting their dominance over Atlantic trade networks that had flourished for centuries before Roman expansion into Gaul. Their principal settlements were constructed on rocky promontories that jutted into the ocean, connected to the mainland by narrow causeways that could be easily defended, or, when necessary, completely severed to transform defensive positions into impregnable island fortresses. These settlements commanded strategic positions along shipping routes that carried British tin southward to Mediterranean markets, Germanic amber westward to Atlantic ports, and various luxury goods northward from Roman territories to British and Germanic customers. The maritime supremacy of the Veneti rested upon shipbuilding technologies that had been refined through generations of experience navigating the dangerous waters of the Atlantic coast. Their vessels were substantially larger and more robust than Mediterranean galleys, constructed with thick oak planks that could withstand the pounding of Atlantic storms and the grinding contact with rocky shorelines that characterized their operational environment. The ships featured high prows and sterns that rode over ocean swells rather than cutting through them, while their broad beams provided stability in rough seas and ample cargo capacity for the extensive trading operations that formed the foundation of Veneti, wealth, and political power. The construction techniques employed by Veneti shipwrights reflected sophisticated understanding of the specific demands imposed by Atlantic conditions, rather than relying on the bronze rams and lightweight construction that characterized Mediterranean warships. Veneti vessels employed iron fastenings and reinforced hull designs that prioritized durability over speed. Their sails were made from leather rather than linen, providing superior resistance to the salt spray and harsh weather conditions that could quickly destroy conventional Mediterranean rigging. The ship's deep drafts and heavy construction made them unsuitable for river operations or shallow coastal waters, but they were ideally adapted for the deep water sailing that dominated Atlantic commerce. The tactical employment of these vessels demonstrated Veneti understanding of naval warfare principles that differed fundamentally from Roman concepts developed in Mediterranean environments. Veneti naval tactics emphasized the use of superior ship construction and seamanship to maintain advantageous positions relative to enemy vessels, employing their height advantage to rain down missiles on opponents while avoiding the ramming attacks that formed the core of Roman naval doctrine. Their crews included experienced sailors who'd spent their entire lives navigating Atlantic waters, giving them intimate knowledge of tidal patterns, wind conditions, and coastal hazards that could be exploited against unfamiliar opponents. The economic foundation of Veneti power extended far beyond simple maritime commerce to encompass control over the tin trade routes that connected British mining regions with Mediterranean markets. Cornish tin had been essential to bronze production throughout the ancient world for over a millennium, and the Veneti had established themselves as indispensable intermediaries in this lucrative commerce. Their trading relationships extended northward to British tribes who controlled tin mining operations, and southward to Roman merchants who required steady supplies of this strategic material for military and civilian applications. The wealth generated by this trade had enabled the Veneti to construct and maintain naval forces that dominated the waters around their territories while supporting the fortified settlements that served as bases for their commercial and military operations. Their accumulated resources also allowed them to maintain diplomatic relationships with tribes throughout Atlantic Gaul, creating alliance networks that could provide mutual support against external threats. These alliances were reinforced by marriage connections between Veneti, nobles, and aristocratic families from neighbouring tribes, creating kinship bonds that transcended simple military cooperation. Caesar's initial intelligence about Veneti capabilities came primarily from Roman merchants who had attempted to establish direct trading relationships with British tribes, seeking to bypass Veneti intermediaries and access tin supplies at more favourable prices. These merchants reported that Veneti naval patrols actively prevented unauthorised vessels from reaching British ports, enforcing their commercial monopoly through a combination of diplomatic pressure and military intimidation. Roman attempts to negotiate passage rights had been firmly rejected, with Veneti leaders making clear their determination to maintain exclusive control over British trade relationships. The strategic challenge posed by Veneti maritime dominance became apparent as Caesar analysed the broader implications of their resistance to Roman expansion. Unlike the land-based tribes that had been defeated through traditional Roman military methods, the Veneti could withdraw to their island strongholds whenever Roman forces approached, using their naval superiority to maintain supply lines and communication networks that remained beyond Roman reach. Their ability to control sea lanes also meant that they could potentially coordinate with British tribes to provide external support for continued Gallic resistance efforts. The proconsul's response to the Veneti challenge required fundamental adaptations to Roman military doctrine that had been developed primarily for land-based operations in Mediterranean environments. Caesar recognised that defeating the Veneti would require Roman naval capabilities that could match or overcome their opponents' advantages in ship construction, seamanship, and knowledge of local maritime conditions. This realisation led to one of the most innovative aspects of the entire Gallic campaign: the systematic development of Roman naval forces specifically adapted for Atlantic operations. The construction of a Roman fleet suitable for Atlantic operations presented enormous technical and logistical challenges that required solutions to problems Roman engineers had never previously encountered. Traditional Roman galleys, designed for Mediterranean conditions, were completely inadequate for the rough seas and extreme tidal ranges that characterised Venetama operational areas. Roman shipwrights were forced to develop new construction techniques that incorporated elements of Veneti design while maintaining Roman tactical requirements for ramming attacks and boarding operations. The Roman shipbuilding program was established at multiple locations along the Atlantic coast, utilising local timber resources while importing specialised materials and skilled craftsmen from throughout the Roman world. The construction sites were heavily fortified to protect against Veneti raids, while Roman engineers worked to understand the specific requirements for vessels that could operate effectively in Atlantic conditions. The project required enormous quantities of iron for fastenings, leather for sails, and seasoned timber for hulls, straining Roman supply systems that had been designed primarily to support land-based military operations. Decimus Brutus, appointed by Caesar to command the developing Roman fleet, faced the additional challenge of training crews who could handle vessels operating in unfamiliar maritime environments. Roman naval personnel had extensive experience with Mediterranean galley operations, but Atlantic sailing required different skills and knowledge that could only be acquired through practical experience in local waters. The training program included instruction in tidal navigation, storm sailing, and the specialised seamanship techniques necessary for operating larger, heavier vessels in rough sea conditions. The development of tactical innovations specifically designed to counter Veneti naval advantages became a crucial aspect of Roman preparations. Caesar's engineers developed specialised equipment, including long poles fitted with sharp hooks that could be used to cut Veneti rigging, potentially disabling enemy vessels and negating their advantages in ship construction and seamanship. These siege hooks represented adaptations of land-based siege equipment to naval applications, demonstrating Roman willingness to experiment with unconventional approaches when traditional methods proved inadequate. The Roman tactical approach also incorporated coordinated operations between land and naval forces, designed to exploit the geographical characteristics of Veneti settlements. While Roman naval forces engaged Veneti fleets in open water, land-based legions would advance against coastal strongholds, creating multiple simultaneous threats that could prevent Veneti forces from concentrating their defensive efforts. This coordination required sophisticated communication systems and precise timing to ensure that naval and land operations supported rather than interfered with each other. The first major naval engagement between Roman and Venetist forces occurred in the sheltered waters of Quiberon Bay, where geographical conditions provided natural boundaries that prevented either side from avoiding decisive combat. The battle demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman tactical innovations and the formidable capabilities of Veneti naval forces fighting in their home waters. Veneti vessels initially maintained their traditional advantages through superior seamanship and knowledge of local conditions, using wind and tide to maintain favourable positions while subjecting Roman ships to sustained missile attacks. The turning point in the engagement came when Roman crews successfully employed their siege hooks to sever the leather rigging of several Veneti vessels, leaving them helpless in the water and vulnerable to ramming attacks by Roman galleys. The psychological impact of seeing their supposedly invincible ships disabled by Roman innovations spread panic through the Veneti fleet, leading to the collapse of their tactical formation and the capture or destruction of most of their naval forces. The victory established Roman control over the waters around Veneti's territories, while demonstrating that Roman tactical flexibility could overcome even the most specialised defensive advantages. The defeat of the Veneti fleet had immediate strategic consequences that extended far beyond the elimination of their naval capabilities. The destruction of Veneti maritime power severed the commercial networks that had sustained their wealth and political influence, while the capture of their principal strongholds eliminated the defensive positions that had protected their territories from land-based attacks. Roman control of former Veneti territories provided access to the tin trade routes that connected British and continental markets, creating new sources of revenue while establishing Roman presence along the Atlantic coast. The success of Roman naval operations against the Veneti encouraged Caesar to consider more ambitious maritime ventures that could extend Roman influence beyond the traditional boundaries of continental operations. The intelligence gathered during the Veneti campaign had provided detailed information about British tribes, their military capabilities, and the geographical challenges that would confront any attempted invasion of the island. This information, combined with the availability of naval forces adapted for Atlantic operations, made British expeditions appear both feasible and potentially profitable. The strategic motivations for a British expedition encompassed multiple considerations that reflected both immediate tactical advantages and longer-term political benefits. Intelligence gathering represented a crucial objective, as Roman knowledge of British tribal structures, military capabilities, and geographical conditions remained extremely limited, despite centuries of indirect contact through Gallic intermediaries. A successful reconnaissance in force could provide essential information for future operations while demonstrating Roman capabilities to potential British allies and enemies alike. The prestige value of a British expedition held particular appeal for Caesar's political ambitions in Rome. No Roman general had previously led forces across the dangerous waters that separated Britain from the continent, and success in such an unprecedented venture would generate enormous public attention and political capital. The expedition would also demonstrate Caesar's willingness to push Roman military capabilities beyond traditional boundaries, reinforcing his reputation as an innovative commander capable of achieving victories that other generals considered impossible. Economic considerations provided additional justification for British operations, as the island was known to contain substantial mineral resources, including tin, gold, and other valuable materials that could generate significant revenues for Roman exploitation. British tribes were also reported to maintain large cattle herds and agricultural surpluses that could support Roman military operations, while providing tribute that would help finance continued Gallic campaigns. The potential for capturing large numbers of slaves during British operations offered another source of revenue that could help offset the enormous costs of maintaining Roman armies in distant territories. The preparation for the first British expedition required careful coordination between naval and land forces, while addressing logistical challenges that exceeded anything Roman armies had previously attempted. The crossing of the English Channel with substantial military forces demanded precise timing to take advantage of favourable weather and tidal conditions, while the uncertainty about British coastal conditions required flexible planning that could adapt to unexpected geographical or tactical situations. Roman engineers worked to develop specialised equipment, including portable bridges, siege engines that could be transported by ship, and supply systems capable of supporting extended operations on an island where local resources might be unavailable or hostile. The selection of forces for the British expedition reflected Caesar's understanding that the operation would require troops capable of adapting to unfamiliar tactical and geographical conditions, while maintaining the discipline and effectiveness that had characterized Roman success throughout the Gallic campaigns. The expedition would include veteran legionaries with extensive experience in diverse combat environments, auxiliary cavalry units that could provide reconnaissance and rapid response capabilities, and specialized engineers whose skills would be essential for establishing secure bases and overcoming British defensive positions. As Roman preparations for the British expedition neared completion during the late summer of 55 BC, Caesar received additional intelligence reports that would influence both the timing and scope of the planned operation, while events along the continental coast continued to require Roman attention and military resources that would affect the forces available for British operations. The intelligence reports reaching Caesar during the final preparations for his first British expedition carried disturbing implications that would fundamentally reshape his strategic calculations for the following year. While Roman naval forces had successfully established temporary beachheads on British shores and demonstrated Roman capability to project military power across the treacherous waters of the Channel, the brief reconnaissance had revealed that any meaningful conquest of British territories would require substantially larger forces, improved logistics, and specialized equipment designed for the unique challenges of island warfare. Simultaneously, reports from Gallic territories indicated growing unrest among tribes that had appeared firmly under Roman control, suggesting that Caesar's absence during extended British operations could provide opportunities for coordinated rebellion that might undo years of military and diplomatic achievements. The lessons learned during the initial British expedition of 55 BC provided Caesar with detailed intelligence about the tactical, logistical, and geographical challenges that would confront any larger-scale invasion. British coastal defences had proven more sophisticated than Roman intelligence had suggested, incorporating both natural obstacles and constructed fortifications that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where British chariots and infantry could exploit their advantages in local terrain knowledge. The tidal ranges along British coasts exceeded anything Roman naval commanders had previously encountered, creating narrow windows of opportunity for amphibious operations, while threatening to strand vessels that miscalculated the timing of their approach or withdrawal. British tribal military capabilities had also exceeded Roman expectations, particularly regarding their use of war chariots that provided mobility and psychological advantages in the rolling terrain that characterized much of southeastern Britain. British charioteers demonstrated remarkable skill in maneuvering their vehicles across difficult ground, while delivering warriors to optimal fighting positions, then withdrawing rapidly to avoid Roman counterattacks. The psychological impact of these unfamiliar tactics on Roman troops, accustomed to facing enemies who fought according to more predictable patterns, had created temporary disruptions in Roman tactical formations that British commanders had attempted to exploit. The logistical requirements for a successful British conquest had become apparent during the brief initial expedition, revealing the enormous quantities of supplies, equipment, and specialized materials that would be necessary for extended operations on an island where local resources might prove inadequate or entirely unavailable. Roman forces had discovered that British agricultural practices differed significantly from continental methods, producing different types of crops that required unfamiliar processing techniques, while supporting livestock populations that could not easily be integrated into Roman supply systems. The absence of established Roman supply depots, roads, and administrative infrastructure meant that invasion forces would need to transport virtually everything required for sustained military operations. Caesar's analysis of these challenges led to comprehensive planning for a second British expedition that would address the deficiencies revealed during the initial reconnaissance, while incorporating tactical and technological innovations specifically designed for British conditions. The scale of the proposed operation would dwarf the previous year's expedition involving 5 full legions supported by substantial cavalry forces, specialised engineering units, and naval contingents capable of maintaining secure supply lines across the Channel throughout an extended campaign season. This force structure would provide sufficient military strength to engage major British tribal coalitions, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for operations across varied geographical terrain. The construction of specialised transport vessels represented one of the most innovative aspects of Caesar's preparations for the Second British Expedition. Roman shipwrights, working under the supervision of experienced naval architects, developed new designs that incorporated lessons learned during previous Atlantic operations, while addressing the specific requirements for transporting large numbers of horses, siege equipment, and bulk supplies across the challenging waters of the English Channel. These vessels featured lower profiles that reduced their vulnerability to British missile attacks during beach landings, while reinforced construction techniques provided improved durability for the repeated groundings that amphibious operations would require. The transport ships incorporated specialised loading and unloading systems that could facilitate rapid deployment of troops and equipment under potentially hostile conditions. Wide loading ramps allowed cavalry units to disembark quickly while maintaining formation integrity, while internal compartments were designed to protect essential supplies from seawater damage during rough crossings. The vessels also included provisions for carrying the portable bridges, siege engines, and construction materials that would be essential for establishing secure beachheads and advancing inland against British defensive positions. Roman naval preparations extended beyond simple transport capabilities to encompass comprehensive systems for maintaining communication and supply relationships between British operations and continental bases. Fast courier vessels were designed specifically for carrying dispatches and essential personnel across the Channel, while larger supply ships could deliver regular shipments of food, weapons, medical supplies, and replacement equipment to Roman forces operating in British territories. These logistical arrangements required careful coordination with weather patterns and tidal conditions that could affect the timing and safety of channel crossings. The selection and training of forces for the Second British Expedition reflected Caesar's understanding that island warfare would require troops capable of adapting quickly to unfamiliar tactical situations, while maintaining the discipline and effectiveness that had characterised Roman success throughout the Gallic campaigns. Veteran legionaries with extensive experience in diverse combat environments formed the core of the expedition force, providing stability and tactical expertise that could be crucial during encounters with British military innovations. These experienced soldiers had demonstrated their ability to adapt Roman tactical principles to unexpected situations while maintaining unit cohesion under difficult conditions. Auxiliary cavalry units selected for the British expedition included both Gallic horsemen, familiar with Celtic warfare methods, and Germanic riders whose experience with similar terrain and tactical challenges could prove valuable in British operations. The cavalry contingent was substantially larger than that employed during the initial expedition, reflecting Caesar's recognition that British mobility advantages could only be countered through superior numbers and tactical flexibility in Roman mounted forces. These units underwent specialised training in amphibious operations, learning techniques for disembarking from transport vessels and rapidly forming combat formations on potentially hostile beaches. Engineering units assigned to the British expedition received extensive preparation in the construction and deployment of portable equipment, designed specifically for island operations. Roman engineers developed prefabricated bridge components that could be quickly assembled to span British rivers and defensive ditches, while siege equipment was modified to facilitate transport by ship and rapid deployment in unfamiliar terrain. The engineering contingent also included specialists in fortification construction, who could establish secure bases and supply depots that would support extended Roman operations in British territories. The diplomatic preparations for the Second British Expedition involved extensive negotiations with British tribal leaders, who had established contact with Roman forces during the previous year's operations. Caesar's envoys worked to identify potential British allies who might provide intelligence, supplies, or military support in exchange for favourable treatment under Roman administration. These diplomatic efforts reveal the complex tribal relationships that characterised British political structures, including long-standing rivalries and alliance patterns that Roman commanders might exploit to prevent unified British resistance. Cassivellaunus, the British leader who had emerged as the primary coordinator of resistance during the initial Roman expedition, became the focus of particular Roman attention as Caesar's intelligence network sought to understand his political position and military capabilities. Reports indicated that Cassivellaunus commanded substantial military resources while maintaining diplomatic relationships with tribes throughout southeastern Britain, creating the potential for coordinated resistance that could pose serious challenges to Roman invasion plans. Roman efforts to identify rivals or enemies of Cassivellaunus who might be willing to cooperate with Roman forces became a crucial aspect of pre-invasion planning. The timing of the second British expedition was carefully coordinated with the agricultural calendar and weather patterns that would affect both the crossing itself and subsequent operations in British territories. Caesar selected a departure date that would take advantage of favourable winds and tidal conditions, while ensuring that Roman forces would arrive in Britain during the season when local food supplies would be most abundant. The expedition's schedule also accounted for the need to complete major military operations and establish secure winter quarters before the onset of harsh weather that could isolate Roman forces from continental support. The departure of the Roman expedition force from continental ports in the early summer of 54 BC created a spectacle that demonstrated both the scale of Roman military capabilities and Caesar's commitment to extending Roman power beyond traditional geographical boundaries. The fleet of transport and escort vessels stretched across miles of coastal waters, carrying not only the soldiers and equipment necessary for military operations, but also the administrative personnel, craftsmen and specialists who would be required to establish Roman governmental structures in conquered British territories. The Channel crossing proceeded more smoothly than the previous year's operation, benefiting from improved ship designs, better weather forecasting, and the experience gained during earlier naval operations in Atlantic waters. Roman naval commanders had developed more sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns and wind conditions that affected Channel navigation, while improved coordination between transport vessels reduced the confusion and delays that had characterised the initial British expedition. The successful crossing demonstrated Roman ability to project substantial military forces across significant water barriers, establishing a precedent for future amphibious operations. The British landing operations revealed both the improvements in Roman amphibious capabilities and the enhanced defensive preparations that British tribes had implemented during the year following the initial Roman expedition. British forces had constructed more extensive coastal fortifications while developing tactical innovations designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of troops disembarking from ships under potentially hostile conditions. The engagement between Roman landing forces and British coastal defenders provided both sides with opportunities to test tactical modifications that developed since their previous encounters. Roman tactical adaptations for British conditions included new formations specifically designed for operations against war chariots, incorporating flexible deployment patterns that could respond rapidly to the mobility advantages that British charioteers enjoyed in familiar terrain. Roman infantry units practiced coordinated movements that could maintain formation integrity while adapting to the rolling landscapes that characterised much of southeastern Britain, while cavalry units developed techniques for operating effectively alongside infantry formations in terrain that differed significantly from the open plains where Roman mounted tactics had been perfected. The establishment of secure beachheads and supply bases demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities, while revealing the logistical complexities involved in maintaining substantial military forces on an island separated from their primary supply sources by dangerous waters. Roman engineers constructed fortified compounds that could protect accumulated supplies, while providing secure bases for further inland operations, incorporating defensive features adapted to British tactical methods and geographical conditions. These installations included specialised facilities for maintaining and repairing the ships that would be essential for continued communication with continental territories. The inland advance of Roman forces brought them into contact with British tribal coalitions that had spent the intervening year preparing coordinated resistance strategies designed to exploit Roman unfamiliarity with local terrain and tactical conditions. British leaders had developed plans for drawing Roman forces into unfavourable geographical positions where their advantages in discipline and equipment could be neutralised through superior knowledge of local conditions and coordinated attacks by multiple tribal contingents. These defensive preparations reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman military methods and careful analysis of the tactical lessons learned during the previous year's encounters. The negotiations between Caesar and British tribal leaders revealed the complex political relationships that would determine the success or failure of Roman efforts to establish permanent control over British territories. British tribal assemblies had debated various approaches to dealing with Roman military presence, ranging from continued armed resistance to accommodation arrangements that might preserve tribal autonomy under Roman oversight. These internal debates reflected broader uncertainties about Roman intentions and the potential consequences of different responses to Roman expansion. Cassivellaunus emerged as the primary spokesman for British resistance, coordinating military operations while simultaneously engaging in diplomatic communications that sought to establish terms for potential accommodation with Roman authority. His position required delicate balancing between maintaining the unity of British tribal coalitions and exploring possibilities for agreements that might preserve British political structures under Roman administration. The tribute arrangements that eventually emerged from these negotiations reflected both Roman determination to extract tangible benefits from their British operations and British recognition that continued military resistance might result in more severe consequences. The tribute agreements negotiated between Caesar and various British tribes established precedents for Roman administrative practices that would influence future relationships between Roman authorities and conquered peoples. These arrangements specified quantities of grain, livestock, precious metals, and other valuable commodities that British communities would provide to Roman forces, while also including provisions for hostages who would guarantee tribal compliance with agreed terms. The tribute system created economic relationships that bound British tribes to Roman interests, while providing revenues that could help finance continued Roman military operations. However, even as Roman forces achieved tactical successes and negotiated favourable arrangements with British tribal leaders, reports from continental Gaul carried increasingly disturbing intelligence about developing unrest among tribes that had previously appeared firmly under Roman control. The absence of Caesar and substantial Roman military forces during the British expedition had created opportunities for Gallic resistance movements that had been carefully planning coordinated uprisings designed to exploit Roman vulnerabilities and restore tribal independence throughout the conquered territories. The Eburonans, led by their chieftains Ambiorix and Catuvolcus, had emerged as the focal point for anti-Roman resistance activities that extended far beyond their own tribal boundaries. Their territories along the Rhine provided them with access to Germanic allies who could offer military support, while their strategic position allowed them to coordinate communications between resistance movements in different regions of Gaul. Intelligence reports indicated that Eburon's envoys had been conducting secret negotiations with tribal leaders throughout Gaul, seeking to establish unified resistance strategies that could overwhelm scattered Roman garrisons before Caesar's return from Britain. The massacre of Sabinus and Cotta's legions at Aduatuca represented the most dramatic manifestation of this coordinated resistance effort, revealing both the extent of Gallic planning and the vulnerability of Roman forces when dispersed across extensive territories without adequate mutual support. The destruction of an entire Roman legion demonstrated that Gallic military capabilities remained formidable when properly coordinated, while the circumstances of the defeat revealed critical weaknesses in Roman intelligence gathering and strategic planning that had allowed the resistance movement to achieve complete tactical surprise. The intelligence reaching Caesar during his return from Britain painted a picture of systematic coordination among Gallic resistance movements that had exploited Roman dispersal across winter quarters with devastating effectiveness. The massacre at Aduatuca had eliminated not merely a substantial Roman military force, but had also demonstrated to tribes throughout Gaul that Roman legions could be defeated through careful planning and tactical innovation. Arvernian, the Eburones chieftain who had orchestrated this spectacular victory, had transformed himself overnight from a relatively minor tribal leader into a symbol of successful resistance that inspired anti-Roman movements across the breadth of Gallic territory. The geographical advantages that had enabled Arvernian's initial success against Sabinus and Cotta's forces extended far beyond the specific location of Aduatuca to encompass the entire character of Eburones' territory. The Ardennes forest region provided natural defensive advantages that neutralized traditional Roman tactical superiority, while offering countless opportunities for the kind of irregular warfare at which Celtic warriors had always excelled. Dense woodlands broken by narrow valleys, swift-flowing streams and rocky outcroppings created terrain where Roman formations could be easily ambushed, while Eburones' fighters could disappear into familiar landscapes that had sheltered their ancestors for generations. Arvernian demonstrated remarkable strategic acumen in his exploitation of these geographical advantages, developing tactical innovations that represented significant advances over traditional Celtic warfare methods. Rather than relying on the mass infantry charges that had characterized previous Gallic resistance efforts, Arvernian organized his warriors into small, highly mobile units that could strike rapidly against isolated Roman detachments before melting back into the forest cover that provided both concealment and protection. These tactics required extensive coordination between multiple groups operating across wide geographical areas, demanding communication systems and command structures that reflected sophisticated military organization. The Eburones' resistance network extended far beyond the boundaries of their tribal territory to encompass alliance relationships with neighbouring communities that had their own grievances against Roman administration. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine provided both warriors and material support, viewing Eburones' resistance as an opportunity to weaken Roman frontier defences while potentially recovering territories lost during earlier conflicts with Roman forces. These cross-Rhine connections gave Arvernian access to military resources that substantially exceeded what his own tribe could provide, while also offering secure bases where Eburones' fighters could retreat when Roman pressure became too intense. The tactical innovations developed by Arvernian's forces represented fundamental adaptations to the realities of fighting Roman legions in forested terrain where traditional Celtic advantages in individual combat skills could be maximized while Roman superiority in disciplined formation fighting was minimized. Eburones' warriors learned to exploit natural features like fallen trees, rocky outcroppings, and stream beds that could provide cover while allowing them to deliver missile attacks against Roman formations that were constrained by narrow forest paths and limited visibility. These ambush tactics required precise timing and coordination, as premature attacks could allow Roman forces to deploy effectively, while delayed strikes might miss opportunities to catch enemies in vulnerable positions. The forest warfare techniques employed by Eburones' fighters included sophisticated use of natural materials for constructing temporary fortifications and obstacles that could channel Roman movements into predetermined killing zones. Fallen logs were arranged to create barriers that forced Roman formations to bunch together while climbing over or around obstacles, creating dense target concentrations for Eburones' spears and arrows. Concealed pits containing sharpened stakes were positioned along likely Roman approach routes, creating hazards that could disable soldiers while spreading fear among units advancing through unfamiliar terrain where any step might trigger hidden dangers. Caesar's initial response to the Eburones' uprising revealed his recognition that conventional Roman tactical approaches would prove inadequate against an enemy that refused to engage in traditional battlefield confrontations. The proconsul assembled forces specifically adapted for forest operations, including increased numbers of auxiliary troops familiar with irregular warfare methods and specialized equipment designed for combat in heavily wooded terrain. Roman engineers developed portable bridges and road-building equipment that could facilitate movement through areas where existing paths were inadequate for large military formations, while also creating tools for clearing forest obstacles that might impede Roman advances. The systematic devastation of Eburone's territory represented Caesar's adaptation of traditional Roman siege warfare principles to the challenges of combating an enemy that could not be brought to decisive battle through conventional means. Roman forces began implementing scorched earth tactics designed to deny Eburone's fighters the resources necessary for continued resistance, while forcing the civilian population to choose between submission and starvation. These operations targeted agricultural stores, livestock herds, and settlements that provided the economic foundation for Eburone's military activities, creating conditions where continued resistance would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The destruction of Eburone's agricultural infrastructure required careful coordination between multiple Roman columns operating simultaneously across extensive territories. Roman forces systematically burned granaries, destroyed stored grain supplies, and slaughtered livestock that could not be transported to Roman camps, creating food shortages that would affect not only Eburone's fighters, but also the civilian population that supported their resistance activities. These operations were timed to coincide with critical periods in the agricultural calendar when the destruction of crops or stored supplies would have maximum impact on Eburone's ability to sustain their population through the coming winter months. Roman devastation efforts extended beyond simple destruction of material resources to encompass systematic elimination of the infrastructure that supported Eburone's society and culture. Sacred groves that served as religious centres were cut down and burned, eliminating gathering places where tribal assemblies had made political decisions while destroying sites that held deep spiritual significance for Eburone's communities. Fortified settlements were not merely captured but completely demolished, with their defensive works filled in and their buildings reduced to rubble that could not provide shelter for returning populations. The psychological impact of the systematic destruction represented a crucial component of Caesar's strategy for breaking Eburone's resistance. The visible elimination of everything that had defined Eburone's territorial identity was designed to convince both fighters and civilians that continued resistance would result in the complete obliteration of their cultural and social existence. Roman forces made deliberate efforts to ensure that destruction was visible from great distances, creating columns of smoke that could be seen throughout the region while leaving devastated landscapes that served as permanent reminders of the consequences of opposing Roman authority. Ambiorix's response to Roman devastation tactics demonstrated his understanding that traditional defensive strategies would prove inadequate against an enemy willing to destroy everything rather than accept continued resistance. The Eburone's chieftain adapted his tactical approach to emphasize maximum mobility, while minimizing dependence on fixed resources that Roman forces could target for destruction. Eburone's fighters learned to carry all essential supplies with them during operations, establishing temporary camps that could be abandoned quickly when Roman forces approached, while maintaining the ability to strike at Roman targets before disappearing into forest cover. The evolution of Eburone's guerrilla tactics included increasingly sophisticated methods for gathering intelligence about Roman movements and intentions. Eburone's scouts developed networks of observation posts throughout the forest region, using elevated positions and concealed shelters to monitor Roman activities while maintaining communication systems that could rapidly transmit information across extensive territories. These intelligence networks enabled Ambiorix to coordinate attacks against Roman supply columns, isolated detachments, and construction parties while avoiding confrontations with main Roman forces that possessed overwhelming tactical advantages. Caesar's diplomatic efforts to isolate the Eburones from potential allies represented another crucial aspect of his comprehensive strategy for eliminating their resistance. Roman envoys worked systematically to convince neighbouring tribes that supporting Eburones' resistance would result in similar devastation of their own territories, while offering favourable terms to communities that actively assisted Roman operations against Ambiorix's forces. These negotiations required careful balancing between threats and incentives, as excessive Roman demands might drive additional tribes into alliance with the Eburones, while insufficient pressure might fail to secure the cooperation necessary for successful anti-guerrilla operations. The most dramatic success of Caesar's diplomatic campaign involved his negotiations with Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, who had previously provided support for Eburones' resistance activities. Roman diplomatic missions crossed the Great River to offer Germanic leaders opportunities to participate in the destruction of Eburones' territory, while claiming substantial portions of the devastated lands for their own settlement purposes. These arrangements transformed traditional Germanic allies of the Eburones into active participants in Roman military operations, providing additional manpower while eliminating crucial sources of external support for continued Eburones' resistance. Germanic participation in anti-Eburones operations brought thousands of experienced warriors into Roman service, while providing Caesar with allies who understood forest warfare techniques and possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain where Eburones fighters had been operating. Germanic tribes contributed not only military manpower, but also specialised skills in tracking, hunting, and survival techniques that proved invaluable for operations in heavily forested regions, where Roman soldiers often struggled with unfamiliar environmental conditions. The psychological impact of seeing their former Germanic allies participating in the destruction of their territory dealt severe blows to Eburones' morale, while demonstrating the extent of their diplomatic isolation. The systematic nature of Roman operations against Eburones' territory created conditions where civilian populations faced impossible choices between continued support for resistance activities and submission to Roman authority that might offer survival opportunities. Roman forces deliberately targeted areas where non-combatant populations had sought refuge, making clear that neutrality would not be recognised, and that all Eburones' communities would face destruction unless they actively opposed Ambiorix's resistance efforts. These tactics created internal pressures within Eburones society, as families and communities debated whether continued resistance justified the risks of complete annihilation. The effectiveness of Roman pressure tactics became apparent as increasing numbers of Eburones fighters began deserting Ambiorix's forces to seek individual accommodation with Roman authorities. The constant threat of attack, combined with the destruction of their homes and the elimination of food supplies, created conditions where continued resistance required enormous personal sacrifices that many warriors found increasingly difficult to justify. Roman commanders offered amnesty terms to individual deserters, while making clear that such opportunities would not remain available indefinitely, creating additional incentives for Eburones fighters to abandon their resistance activities. Ambiorix's efforts to maintain unity among his remaining followers required increasingly desperate measures as Roman pressure intensified and Germanic allies joined the systematic devastation of Eburones' territory. The chieftain was forced to resort to harsh disciplinary measures against warriors who showed signs of wavering loyalty, while simultaneously attempting to maintain morale through promises of eventual victory that became less credible as Roman control over the region continued to expand. The challenges of maintaining effective resistance under such conditions revealed both the strengths and limitations of the guerrilla warfare methods that had initially proven so successful against Roman forces. The gradual contraction of areas where Eburones fighters could operate safely reflected the cumulative impact of sustained Roman pressure, combined with the participation of Germanic allies who possessed comparable knowledge of forest terrain and irregular warfare techniques. Roman forces established networks of fortified positions that controlled key river crossings, mountain passes, and forest paths, creating barriers that restricted Eburones' movement while providing secure bases for continued operations against remaining resistant strongholds. These fortifications were positioned to support each other through coordinated defensive arrangements, while serving as launching points for offensive operations that could respond rapidly to intelligence about Eburone's activities. The adaptation of Roman military doctrine to forest warfare conditions represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of Caesar's entire Gallic campaign, demonstrating Roman ability to modify traditional approaches when confronted with enemies who refused to fight according to conventional patterns. Roman soldiers learned to operate effectively in small units that could navigate forest terrain while maintaining communication with supporting forces, developing skills in individual combat and survival techniques that complemented their traditional advantages in disciplined formation fighting. These adaptations required extensive training and equipment modifications that reflected Roman commitment to achieving decisive victory regardless of the tactical challenges involved. The systematic destruction of Eburone's territory and the relentless pursuit of Ambiorix through the Ardennes had demonstrated Roman capabilities in irregular warfare, yet these victories masked a fundamental transformation occurring throughout Gaul during the winter of 52 BC. While Caesar's legions methodically eliminated pockets of resistance and Germanic allies claimed devastated Eburone's lands for settlement, a new form of opposition was crystallizing around a young Arvernian nobleman whose vision extended far beyond the localized rebellions that had characterized previous Gallic resistance efforts. Vercingetorix, son of Celtic, who had once aspired to restore Arvernian kingship before his execution by tribal rivals, had spent years analysing Roman military methods and political strategies while developing revolutionary concepts for coordinating Gallic resistance on an unprecedented scale. The emergence of Vercingetorix as a unifying figure represented a dramatic departure from traditional patterns of Gallic leadership that had historically emphasised tribal autonomy and personal charisma over broader strategic coordination. Unlike previous resistance leaders who had operated primarily within their own territorial boundaries while seeking limited alliances with neighbouring communities, Vercingetorix possessed both the aristocratic connections and intellectual capabilities necessary to envision truly unified Gallic opposition to Roman expansion. His noble lineage provided him with access to aristocratic networks throughout central and western Gaul, while his education in Roman political methods had given him sophisticated understanding of the organisational principles that would be required to coordinate resistance efforts across multiple tribal territories. The political climate that enabled Vercingetorix's rise reflected growing recognition among Gallic elites that piecemeal resistance efforts had consistently failed to achieve meaningful results against Roman military and administrative capabilities. The destruction of the Helvetii, the defeat of Ariovistus, the fragmentation of the Belgae Confederation, and the systematic elimination of the Eburones had demonstrated that individual tribal resistance, regardless of its tactical sophistication, could not overcome Roman advantages in resources, organisation, and strategic planning. These failures had created conditions where Gallic leaders were increasingly receptive to alternative approaches that might offer better prospects for preserving tribal independence and cultural autonomy. Vercingetorix's analysis of Roman vulnerabilities revealed several critical weaknesses that coordinated Gallic resistance might exploit. Roman forces remained dispersed across extensive territories in winter quarters that were often isolated from mutual support, creating opportunities for simultaneous attacks that could overwhelm individual garrisons before reinforcements could arrive. Roman supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory, requiring constant protection while remaining vulnerable to coordinated attacks by forces familiar with local terrain and conditions. Most importantly, Roman political unity depended upon continued military success and the regular delivery of plunder and tribute that financed Caesar's political ambitions in Rome, creating pressure points that sustained Gallic resistance might exploit to undermine Roman commitment to continued conquest. The strategic revolution implemented by Vercingetorix, began with his recognition that traditional Celtic warfare methods, despite their effectiveness in individual combat situations, were fundamentally inadequate for confronting Roman tactical advantages in discipline formation fighting. Rather than attempting to match Roman capabilities in conventional battlefield engagements, Vercingetorix developed comprehensive strategies based on avoiding pitched battles while systematically degrading Roman operational capabilities through coordinated attacks on supply lines, isolated detachments, and administrative infrastructure. These tactics required unprecedented levels of coordination between tribal forces that had historically maintained fierce independence, demanding new forms of military organisation and command structures that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. The scorched earth policies advocated by Vercingetorix represented perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of his resistance strategy, requiring Gallic communities to destroy their own agricultural resources and settlements rather than allow them to support Roman military operations. This approach demanded enormous sacrifices from civilian populations who would be forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods, while trusting that coordinated resistance efforts would eventually restore their territories under Gallic rather than Roman control. The implementation of such policies required sophisticated propaganda campaigns that could convince diverse tribal communities that temporary hardships were preferable to permanent subjugation under Roman administrative systems. Vercingetorix's success in building the largest anti-Roman coalition in Gallic history reflected both his personal charismatic abilities and his sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics that governed intertribal relationships throughout the region. His diplomatic efforts emphasized shared cultural and religious traditions that connected all Gallic peoples, while carefully addressing specific grievances and interests that motivated individual tribal participation in coordinated resistance activities. The coalition that emerged under his leadership encompassed tribes from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine frontier, representing an unprecedented level of political cooperation that had never before been achieved in Celtic Europe. The military organisation developed by Vercingetorix incorporated innovations that addressed traditional weaknesses in Celtic warfare while maximising the advantages that Gallic forces possessed over their Roman opponents. Rather than relying on the individual heroism and personal combat skills that had characterised previous Celtic military efforts, Vercingetorix established unified command structures that could coordinate operations across multiple tribal territories while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid response to changing tactical situations. These organisational innovations required extensive training programs that taught warriors from different tribes to operate together effectively while preserving the martial traditions that had made Celtic fighters formidable opponents throughout their history. The contribution of troops from multiple tribes to Vercingetorix's unified army created logistical challenges that required sophisticated administrative systems capable of managing diverse military traditions, equipment standards, and tactical preferences. Arvernian organisational capabilities provided the foundation for these administrative structures, drawing upon the tribe's historical experience in coordinating large-scale military operations while adapting traditional methods to accommodate the unprecedented scale and complexity of the anti-Roman coalition. Supply systems were established that could support armies operating far from their tribal territories for extended periods, while communication networks enabled rapid coordination between forces distributed across the breadth of Gaul. The strategic positioning of fortified oppida throughout Gallic territory provided Vercingetorix with defensive advantages that could be exploited to offset Roman superiority in siege warfare and engineering capabilities. These hilltop settlements, many of which had been fortified over generations of intertribal warfare, offered natural defensive positions that could be enhanced through additional construction while serving as supply bases and communication centres for coordinated resistance operations. The network of oppida created strategic depth that could absorb Roman advances while maintaining secure bases for continued operations, forcing Roman forces to commit substantial resources to siege operations that diverted attention from broader strategic objectives. Caesar's initial intelligence about the developing resistance movement came through his network of Gallic informants and allied tribal leaders who had maintained their relationships with Roman authorities despite growing pressure from anti-Roman factions within their own communities. These reports described not merely another tribal uprising, but a coordinated movement that possessed both the organizational capabilities and strategic vision necessary to pose unprecedented challenges to Roman control over conquered territories. The scale of coordination described in these intelligence reports exceeded anything Roman authorities had previously encountered in Gaul, suggesting that traditional Roman responses might prove inadequate against such sophisticated opposition. The massacre at Cenabum marked the dramatic beginning of coordinated resistance operations that had been carefully planned to achieve maximum psychological impact while demonstrating the extent of anti-Roman sentiment throughout Gallic territory. The systematic elimination of Roman merchants, administrators and settlers in this important commercial centre sent unmistakable messages to both Roman authorities and potential Gallic supporters that neutrality would no longer be tolerated and that the resistance movement possessed both the organisational capabilities and ruthless determination necessary to challenge Roman control directly. The timing of this attack, coordinated with similar operations throughout Gallic territory, revealed the sophisticated communication systems that Vercingetorix had established to coordinate resistance activities. The rapid spread of coordinated attacks throughout central and western Gaul following the Cenabum massacre demonstrated the effectiveness of Vercingetorix's organisational efforts, while revealing the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that had been building throughout the region during years of Roman administrative control. Roman garrisons, supply depots and administrative centres came under simultaneous attack by forces that possessed detailed intelligence about Roman defensive arrangements and tactical capabilities. These coordinated operations achieved tactical surprise that had been impossible during previous resistance efforts, overwhelming isolated Roman positions before effective defensive measures could be implemented. Roman casualties during the initial phase of coordinated resistance operations exceeded anything Caesar had experienced during his previous Gallic campaigns, reflecting both the scale of the attacks and the tactical sophistication of forces operating under unified command. The loss of administrative personnel, supply stockpiles and communication facilities created immediate operational difficulties for Roman forces, while demonstrating to Gallic communities throughout the region that Roman control was neither permanent nor invulnerable. These early successes provided crucial momentum for resistance recruitment efforts, while establishing Vercingetorix's credibility as a leader capable of achieving meaningful victories against Roman military capabilities. Caesar's response to the coordinated uprising required fundamental modifications to Roman strategic approaches that had been developed for dealing with individual tribal resistance movements. The scale and coordination of Gallic opposition demanded concentration of Roman forces that had previously been dispersed across extensive territories, creating vulnerabilities in areas that would be temporarily abandoned, while potentially allowing Gallic forces to achieve local superiority in regions where Roman concentration was incomplete. These strategic adjustments required careful balancing between immediate tactical necessities and longer-term requirements for maintaining Roman control over conquered territories. The siege of Avaricum emerged as the first major test of Roman capabilities against Vercingetorix's coordinated resistance, providing both sides with opportunities to evaluate their respective tactical innovations under conditions of sustained combat. The Bituriges stronghold occupied a naturally defensible position that had been enhanced through generations of fortification efforts, creating defensive advantages that Roman siege techniques would need to overcome, while Gallic forces tested their abilities to coordinate relief operations with garrison defenders. The strategic importance of Avaricum extended beyond simple territorial control to encompass its role as a major supply centre and communication hub that connected resistance operations throughout central Gaul. Roman siege operations at Avaricum demonstrated Caesar's engineering expertise, while revealing the tactical challenges posed by coordinated Gallic resistance that could threaten siege works from multiple directions simultaneously. Roman engineers constructed elaborate circumvallation systems that protected siege operations from external attack while maintaining pressure on the fortress garrison, employing construction techniques that had been refined through years of siege warfare in diverse geographical and tactical environments. The scale of these engineering works exceeded previous Roman siege operations in Gaul, reflecting both the strategic importance of the target and the enhanced capabilities of Gallic resistance forces. The construction of Roman siege works at Avaricum required enormous quantities of timber, earth, and stone that had to be gathered from surrounding territories, while Roman forces maintained constant vigilance against Gallic attacks designed to disrupt construction activities. Roman soldiers worked in shifts that combined construction duties with military preparedness, developing techniques for rapid transition between engineering tasks and combat readiness when Gallic forces appeared to threaten siege operations. These dual responsibilities created additional strain on Roman forces while demonstrating the adaptability that had characterized Roman military effectiveness throughout the Gallic campaigns. Gallic defensive preparations at Avaricum incorporated innovations designed specifically to counter Roman siege techniques while maximizing the advantages provided by the fortress's natural defensive position. Bituriges engineers modified traditional Celtic fortification methods to include features that could resist Roman battering rams, siege towers, and undermining operations, while creating internal defensive positions that could maintain resistance even after outer walls had been breached. These defensive innovations reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman siege methods, while demonstrating Gallic engineering capabilities that had been enhanced through years of observing Roman construction techniques. The coordination between Avaricum's garrison and external Gallic forces under Vercingetorix's command created tactical challenges for Roman siege operations that exceeded anything Caesar had previously encountered during his Gallic campaigns. Gallic relief forces could threaten Roman siege lines, while garrison defenders launched coordinated attacks from within the fortress, creating simultaneous pressures that tested Roman abilities to maintain siege effectiveness while defending against external threats. These coordinated operations required sophisticated communication systems between garrison and relief forces, while demanding tactical flexibility that could respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. The brutal urban combat that characterized the final phase of the Avaricum siege revealed the psychological and tactical intensity that would characterize the broader conflict between Roman forces and Vercingetorix coordinated resistance. Roman soldiers fought house to house through narrow streets, while Bituriges defenders used their intimate knowledge of the settlement's layout to create ambush positions and defensive strongpoints that maximize casualties among attacking forces. The confined urban environment negated many traditional Roman tactical advantages, while creating conditions where individual combat skills and personal courage became decisive factors in determining local outcomes. The massacre of Avaricum's population, following the fortress's capture, represented Caesar's deliberate decision to use extreme measures for discouraging continued resistance, while demonstrating the consequences that communities could expect if they supported Vercingetorix's rebellion. Roman soldiers systematically eliminated civilian populations that had supported the garrison's resistance, creating scenes of destruction that were intended to serve as warnings to other Gallic communities considering participation in coordinated resistance activities. The psychological impact of this massacre extended far beyond Avaricum itself, influencing decisions by tribal leaders throughout Gaul regarding their participation in continued resistance efforts. The strategic consequences of the Avaricum siege had barely crystallized when Caesar received intelligence that would fundamentally alter his understanding of Vercingetorix's tactical evolution and the scope of resistance coordination throughout central Gaul. while Roman engineers dismantled the siege works that had enabled their brutal victory, and Roman administrators began organising the systematic exploitation of Bituriges territory, reports arrived describing massive troop concentrations around Gergovia, the principal stronghold of the Arverni tribe and Vercingetorix's ancestral seat of power. The Gallic commander had apparently recognised that his strategy of avoiding pitched battles while harassing Roman supply lines required modification in light of Roman siege capabilities demonstrated at Avaricum, leading him to concentrate substantial forces at a position where geographical advantages might offset Roman tactical superiority. Gergovia occupied one of the most naturally defensible positions in central Gaul, perched atop a volcanic plateau that rose dramatically above the surrounding valleys of the Alia River. The approaches to the fortress were limited to narrow, winding paths that could be easily defended by relatively small numbers of warriors, while channeling attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where Gallic advantages in individual combat could be maximised. The plateau's elevation provided defenders with commanding views of the surrounding countryside, enabling early detection of approaching enemies while offering ideal positions for artillery and missile weapons that could rain destruction down upon forces attempting to assault the stronghold. Water sources within the defensive perimeter ensured that siege operations could not force surrender through thirst, while extensive storage facilities contained supplies sufficient to sustain large garrisons through prolonged blockades. The fortifications surrounding Gergovia had been enhanced over generations of Arverni occupation, incorporating both traditional Celtic defensive techniques and innovations learned through observation of Roman engineering methods. Massive stone walls followed the natural contours of the plateau's edges, creating barriers that were virtually impossible to breach through conventional assault techniques, while incorporating defensive towers and bastions that provided overlapping fields of fire against approaching enemies. The main gate complex featured multiple defensive layers, including outer courtyards, where attackers could be trapped and subjected to concentrated missile fire, while secondary entrances were concealed among rocky outcroppings that provided alternative access routes for defenders while remaining invisible to besieging forces. Caesar's approach to Gergovia reflected his growing understanding that Vercingetorix represented a qualitatively different opponent from previous Gallic leaders, possessing both the strategic vision necessary to coordinate large-scale resistance operations and the tactical sophistication required to exploit Roman vulnerabilities under specific geographical conditions. The Roman proconsul recognized that a direct assault on such a formidable position would likely result in catastrophic casualties, while potentially failing to achieve meaningful strategic objectives. Yet he also understood that bypassing Gergovia would leave Vercingetorix's main force intact while demonstrating Roman inability to overcome determined Gallic resistance in favourable defensive positions. The Roman army that advanced toward Gergovia in the spring of 52 BC represented the culmination of Caesar's military reforms and tactical innovations developed throughout his Gallic campaigns. Veterans from multiple legions provided the core of disciplined infantry that had proven its effectiveness in diverse combat environments, while auxiliary forces included cavalry units from throughout the Roman sphere of influence and specialised troops trained in siege warfare, mountain combat, and irregular operations. The baggage train accompanying this force carried not only standard military supplies, but also the sophisticated engineering equipment that Roman siege operations required, including prefabricated siege tower components, specialised tools for undermining fortifications, and materials for constructing the elaborate circumvallation systems that had proven essential for successful fortress reductions. Vercingetorix's defensive preparations at Gergovia incorporated lessons learned from the Avaricum siege, while adapting traditional Gallic military methods to exploit the specific advantages provided by the plateau's geography. Rather than concentrating all defensive efforts within the fortress walls, Gallic forces established multiple defensive lines that extended down the plateau's slopes, creating successive barriers that could delay and weaken Roman assault forces while providing fallback positions if outer defences were breached. These defensive arrangements included concealed obstacles, camouflaged pits containing sharpened stakes, and carefully positioned artillery that could deliver devastating fire against Roman formations attempting to advance up the narrow approach paths. The Gallic garrison at Gergovia included not only Arverni warriors fighting to defend their ancestral stronghold, but also contingents from tribes throughout central and western Gaul, who had committed their best fighters to this crucial defensive effort. These diverse forces brought different tactical traditions and specialised skills that Vercingetorix integrated into comprehensive defensive plans designed to maximise casualties among Roman assault forces while preserving Gallic capabilities for continued resistance operations. Nervii warriors contributed their expertise in forest fighting and ambush tactics, while Sequani fighters provided knowledge of mountain warfare techniques that could be adapted to the plateau's terrain. Caesar's initial reconnaissance of Gergovia's defences revealed the extraordinary challenges that any assault operation would face, while confirming intelligence reports about the scale of Gallic forces concentrated within the stronghold. Roman scouts operating under cover of darkness mapped the defensive arrangements while identifying potential weaknesses that might be exploited through coordinated attacks, yet their reports consistently emphasised the strength of Gallic positions and the difficulties that conventional Roman tactics would encounter in such terrain. The plateau's elevation negated Roman advantages in siege engines and artillery, while the narrow approach paths prevented deployment of the massive formations that had proven decisive in previous Roman victories. The Roman siege operations at Gergovia began with attempts to establish the circumvallation systems that had proven effective during previous fortress reductions. Yet the geographical characteristics of the plateau created unprecedented challenges for traditional Roman engineering approaches. The rocky terrain resisted conventional earthwork construction, while the elevation differences between Roman positions and Gallic defences created sightline problems that complicated artillery deployment and coordination between different sections of the siege works. Roman engineers were forced to develop innovative construction techniques that could overcome these geographical obstacles while maintaining the defensive effectiveness that circumvallation systems required for protecting besieging forces from external attack. Gallic harassment of Roman construction efforts demonstrated Vercingetorix's tactical sophistication, while revealing the extent to which coordinated resistance had evolved beyond simple defensive operations. Small groups of Gallic fighters launched carefully coordinated attacks against Roman work parties, employing hit-and-run tactics that inflicted casualties while disrupting construction schedules and forcing Roman commanders to divert substantial forces to protective duties. These harassment operations were timed to coincide with weather conditions and visibility limitations that maximised their effectiveness while minimising Gallic casualties, reflecting sophisticated understanding of tactical principles that had been refined through extensive combat experience. The first major Roman assault on Gergovia's outer defences occurred after several weeks of siege preparation, launched at dawn when morning mist provided concealment for advancing forces while reducing the effectiveness of Gallic missile weapons positioned on the plateau's heights. Roman legionaries advanced in carefully coordinated formations designed to maximise their advantages in disciplined fighting while minimising exposure to Gallic artillery and archery fire, employing shield formations and tactical movements that had been adapted specifically for assault operations in mountainous terrain. The attacking forces included specialised assault troops equipped with scaling ladders, siege hooks, and other equipment necessary for overcoming fortified positions, while supporting units provided covering fire and prepared to exploit any breaches that assault forces might create. The Gallic defence of their outer positions demonstrated both individual courage and tactical coordination that exceeded anything Roman forces had previously encountered during their Gallic campaigns. Arverni warriors fought with desperate determination to protect their ancestral stronghold, while contingents from allied tribes provided mutual support that prevented Roman forces from achieving local breakthroughs that might have led to broader tactical success. Gallic commanders displayed remarkable skill in coordinating defensive efforts across multiple threatened sectors while maintaining reserves that could respond rapidly to unexpected Roman tactical innovations or temporary defensive failures. The failure of Roman assault forces to achieve meaningful penetration of Gallic defensive lines marked Caesar's first significant tactical defeat since the beginning of his Gallic campaigns, revealing limitations in Roman military capabilities when confronted with determined enemies fighting in favourable terrain under unified command. Roman casualties during the failed assault exceeded losses from any previous engagement in Gaul, including substantial numbers of veteran soldiers whose experience and training represented irreplaceable assets for continued military operations. The psychological impact of this reverse affected Roman morale throughout the army, while providing enormous encouragement to Gallic resistance movements that had been watching the siege operations with intense interest. Caesar's response to the tactical failure at Gergovia demonstrated both his personal resilience and his strategic understanding that continued siege operations against such a formidable position would likely result in additional casualties without achieving meaningful military objectives. Rather than persisting with assault attempts that had proven futile, the Roman commander chose to withdraw his forces while they retained sufficient strength to conduct effective operations elsewhere, recognizing that strategic flexibility was more valuable than stubborn adherence to initial operational plans that had proven inadequate. This decision required considerable moral courage, as Roman military tradition emphasized persistence and ultimate victory, regardless of temporary setbacks or casualties. The Roman withdrawal from Gergovia created immediate strategic consequences that extended far beyond the specific tactical failure to capture the Arvernian stronghold. News of Roman defeat spread rapidly throughout Gaul, encouraging tribes that had remained neutral to reconsider their positions while providing concrete evidence that Roman military capabilities were not invincible when confronted with properly coordinated Gallic resistance. Tribal leaders who had been hesitant to commit fully to Vercingetorix's coalition now began contributing substantial military resources to the resistance effort, recognizing that Roman vulnerability created opportunities for achieving meaningful political objectives through continued coordinated opposition. Vercingetorix's strategic response to his defensive success at Gergovia revealed his understanding that tactical victories needed to be converted into broader strategic advantages through continued offensive operations that could exploit Roman vulnerabilities while they remained psychologically and militarily weakened by their recent defeat. Rather than remaining in defensive positions that had proven effective, the Gallic commander chose to concentrate his enlarged forces for operations designed to eliminate Roman capabilities entirely, while demonstrating to all Gallic tribes that complete victory over Roman occupation was achievable through unified resistance efforts. The concentration of Gallic forces at Alesia represented Vercingetorix's most ambitious strategic gamble, bringing together the largest Celtic army ever assembled while occupying a position that offered both defensive advantages and opportunities for coordinated offensive operations against Roman forces that would be compelled to respond to such a massive threat. The hilltop settlement of Alesia, perched on Montauxois above the surrounding plains of Burgundy, provided natural defensive advantages that rivaled those of Gergovia, while offering superior logistical support for the enormous forces that Vercingetorix was assembling from throughout Gallic territory. The strategic position commanded crucial routes through central Gaul while providing secure communications with tribal territories that continued to supply warriors and resources for the resistance effort. Caesar's decision to pursue Vercingetorix to Alesia reflected his recognition that the Gallic commander's growing strength posed existential threats to Roman control throughout Gaul that could not be addressed through defensive measures or limited offensive operations. The Roman proconsul understood that failure to engage and defeat the concentrated Gallic forces would likely result in coordinated attacks against scattered Roman positions that could overwhelm individual garrisons, while demonstrating Roman inability to protect their allies and administrative infrastructure. The strategic stakes of the confrontation at Alesia encompassed not merely tactical victory or defeat, but the fundamental question of whether Roman authority could be maintained in Gaul against determined coordinated resistance. The Roman approach to Alesia revealed Caesar's evolution as a military commander, incorporating lessons learned from the Gergovia failure, while adapting traditional Roman siege techniques to address the specific challenges posed by Vercingetorix's defensive preparations and the unprecedented scale of Gallic forces concentrated within the stronghold. Rather than attempting direct assault operations that had proven futile against similar positions, Caesar chose to implement comprehensive blockade strategies designed to force Gallic surrender through starvation, while protecting Roman forces from the coordinated attacks that had characterized previous Gallic defensive efforts. The construction of the double circumvallation at Alesia represented the masterpiece of Roman military engineering, creating defensive systems that simultaneously contained the Gallic forces within the hilltop stronghold while protecting Roman siege forces from external attack by relief armies that Vercingetorix's diplomatic efforts were assembling throughout Gaul. The inner wall, stretching for over 10 miles around the base of Mont Auxois, incorporated sophisticated defensive features including multiple lines of obstacles, carefully positioned artillery emplacements, and internal communication systems that enabled rapid coordination between different sectors of the siege works. The engineering challenges involved in constructing these fortifications across varied terrain while under constant threat of Gallic attack required innovative solutions that pushed Roman construction capabilities to their limits. The outer wall of the Alesia circumvallation extended for 13 miles across the surrounding countryside, creating a protective barrier that could defend Roman siege forces from the massive relief army that tribal contingents throughout Gaul were assembling in response to Vercingetorix's appeals for coordinated support. This outer fortification incorporated lessons learned from previous siege operations while addressing the specific threat posed by external forces that might possess numerical superiority over Roman defensive capabilities. The construction required enormous quantities of timber, stone, and earth that had to be gathered and transported while Roman forces maintained constant vigilance against Gallic attempts to disrupt the engineering work. The defensive obstacles incorporated into both circumvallation lines demonstrated Roman engineering sophistication, while revealing the extent to which Caesar had analysed Gallic tactical methods and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralise their advantages in individual combat and irregular warfare. Concealed pits containing sharpened stakes were positioned to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, while carefully arranged obstacles created barriers that would disrupt Gallic formations while providing Roman defenders with clear fields of fire. The complexity and scale of these defensive arrangements exceeded anything previously attempted in Roman military engineering, reflecting both the strategic importance of the Alesia operation and the formidable nature of the opposition that Roman forces expected to encounter. The three-phase battle that developed around Alesia tested every aspect of Roman military capabilities while demonstrating the tactical sophistication that Vercingetorix had achieved in coordinating large-scale resistance operations. The initial phase involved attempts by the garrison forces within Alesia to break through Roman siege lines, while simultaneously launching attacks designed to disrupt construction of the outer circumvallation, creating multiple simultaneous threats that tested Roman abilities to coordinate defensive responses across extensive fortified positions. These coordinated attacks required precise timing and communication between Gallic forces operating from different positions, revealing the organisational capabilities that Vercingetorix had developed throughout his resistance campaign. The arrival of the massive Gallic relief army marked the beginning of the second phase of the battle, creating conditions where Roman forces found themselves surrounded by enemies while maintaining defensive positions that were simultaneously under attack from internal and external forces. The relief army, reportedly numbering over 250,000 warriors from tribes throughout Gaul, represented the largest Celtic military force ever assembled, bringing together diverse tribal contingents under unified command structures that had been carefully coordinated through months of diplomatic and military preparation. The scale of this force exceeded Roman capabilities for direct confrontation in open battle, requiring defensive strategies that could exploit Roman advantages in fortification and engineering, while negating Gallic superiority in numbers and individual combat skills. Caesar's tactical response to the coordinated Gallic attacks demonstrated his evolution as a military commander, while revealing the flexibility and adaptability that had characterized Roman success throughout the Gallic campaigns. Rather than attempting to maintain static defensive positions that might be overwhelmed by sustained Gallic pressure, Roman forces employed dynamic defense strategies that could respond rapidly to changing tactical situations while maintaining the integrity of their fortified positions. These tactical innovations required extensive coordination between different sections of the Roman forces while demanding individual initiative and tactical flexibility from commanders at every level of the military hierarchy. The climactic phase of the Alesia battle began when Vercingetorix attempted to coordinate simultaneous attacks by garrison forces, relief army contingents, and specialised assault groups that had infiltrated positions threatening crucial sectors of the Roman fortifications. This coordinated offensive represented the culmination of Gallic tactical development under Vercingetorix's leadership, incorporating lessons learned from previous engagements while exploiting intelligence about Roman defensive arrangements that had been gathered through careful reconnaissance and observation of Roman construction activities. The success of this coordinated attack would have resulted in the complete destruction of Roman forces and the liberation of Gaul from Roman occupation, while its failure would effectively end organised Gallic resistance for the foreseeable future. Caesar's personal leadership during the decisive moments of the battle proved crucial to Roman success, as the proconsul led cavalry charges that broke Gallic tactical coordination, while inspiring Roman defenders to maintain their positions despite overwhelming numerical disadvantages. The sight of their commander personally engaging in the most dangerous combat provided psychological reinforcement that enabled Roman forces to withstand Gallic pressure while maintaining the disciplined tactical responses that their defensive success required. Caesar's tactical flexibility during these critical moments demonstrated both his personal courage and his sophisticated understanding of the psychological factors that determined victory or defeat in large-scale combat operations. The collapse of coordinated Gallic resistance following the failure of their final assault created conditions where Vercingetorix faced impossible choices between continued resistance that would result in the complete destruction of his forces and surrender that might preserve some possibility of future Gallic independence. The Gallic commander's decision to surrender himself to Caesar represented both personal sacrifice and strategic calculation, recognizing that his continued resistance would likely result in additional casualties among his followers, while offering little prospect of achieving meaningful military objectives. His dramatic surrender, conducted with full ceremonial dignity, marked the effective end of organised Gallic resistance, while establishing the foundation for Roman administrative control throughout the conquered territories. The strategic consequences of the Alesia victory extended far beyond the immediate military success to encompass fundamental changes in the balance of power throughout Western Europe. Roman control over Gallic territories was now secure against internal resistance, while providing launching points for future operations against Germanic tribes and British communities that had previously remained beyond Roman reach. The wealth extracted from Gallic territories would finance Caesar's political ambitions in Rome, while supporting the military forces necessary for maintaining control over the newly conquered provinces. The systematic Romanization of Gallic society would begin immediately, transforming Celtic communities into integral components of the expanding Roman world, while preserving selected aspects of Gallic culture that could be adapted to Roman administrative requirements. The surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia had shattered the backbone of organised Gallic resistance, Yet Caesar understood that military victory alone would not guarantee lasting Roman control over the vast territories that now lay under his authority. Scattered pockets of defiance persisted throughout the conquered lands, requiring systematic elimination before the process of integration could begin in earnest. The Bellovaci, who had provided substantial contingents to Vercingetorix' relief army, retreated to their heavily forested territories in northern Gaul, where they attempted to maintain independence through guerrilla tactics reminiscent of Ambiorix's earlier resistance. Their strongholds, concealed within dense woodlands that had protected their ancestors for generations, became focal points for warriors who refused to accept Roman dominance and continued launching raids against Roman supply convoys and administrative centres. Caesar's response to these lingering resistance movements demonstrated a marked shift toward increasingly harsh punitive measures that reflected both his determination to eliminate future threats and his understanding that mercy had been interpreted as weakness by those who continued to oppose Roman authority. The campaign against the Bellovaci involved systematic destruction of their forest sanctuaries, with Roman engineers employing fire and specialised cutting equipment to clear vast swaths of woodland that had previously provided concealment for guerrilla operations. Villages discovered supporting resistance fighters faced complete destruction, their populations sold into slavery while their agricultural resources were redistributed to communities that had demonstrated loyalty to Roman administration. The Carnates, whose territory included the sacred groves where druids from throughout Gaul had traditionally gathered for their annual assemblies, found themselves subjected to particularly severe treatment that targeted not only their political resistance, but also the religious infrastructure that had sustained pan-Gallic cultural identity. Roman forces systematically destroyed druidical sanctuaries while executing priests who had played prominent roles in coordinating anti-Roman activities. The elimination of these religious centres served both practical and symbolic purposes, disrupting communication networks that had facilitated resistance coordination, while demonstrating Roman determination to reshape Gallic society according to their own political and cultural requirements. The establishment of permanent Roman garrisons throughout former resistant strongholds marked the beginning of systematic military occupation designed to prevent future uprisings while providing secure bases for continued administrative expansion. These installations were strategically positioned to control river crossings, mountain passes, and trade routes that connected different regions of Gaul, creating networks of mutual support that could respond rapidly to any renewed resistance activities. The garrisons included not only Roman legionaries, but also auxiliary troops recruited from tribes that had demonstrated reliable loyalty to Roman interests, creating mixed forces that combined Roman tactical discipline with intimate knowledge of local conditions and potential threats. The fortified camps established throughout Gaul incorporated sophisticated defensive features that reflected lessons learned during years of irregular warfare against Celtic opponents who had proven remarkably adept at exploiting weaknesses in traditional Roman military installations. Multiple lines of earthworks surrounded each garrison, incorporating concealed obstacles and carefully positioned artillery that could devastate attacking forces while providing secure refuges for Roman administrators, merchants and settlers who were beginning to establish permanent communities throughout the conquered territories. These defensive arrangements also included specialised facilities for storing tribute payments, housing hostages, and maintaining the administrative records that Roman bureaucracy required for effective provincial management. The systematic Romanization of Gaul began immediately following the elimination of organised military resistance, encompassing comprehensive transformation of legal, administrative, and cultural institutions that had governed Celtic society for centuries. Roman legal concepts gradually replaced traditional Gallic customs governing property rights, commercial transactions, and criminal justice, creating unified legal frameworks that facilitated trade and administrative coordination across tribal boundaries that had historically maintained distinct legal traditions. the introduction of Roman law required extensive training programs for Gallic nobles who would serve as intermediaries between Roman administrators and local populations, creating new career opportunities for aristocratic families willing to collaborate with the occupying authorities. Urban planning initiatives transformed existing Gallic settlements while establishing entirely new communities designed according to Roman architectural principles and administrative requirements. The hilltop oppida that had served as defensive strongholds during the resistance period were gradually abandoned in favour of valley settlements that offered better access to transportation networks and agricultural resources. Roman engineers supervised the construction of forums, basilicas, temples, and other public buildings that provided focal points for civic life while demonstrating the material benefits that Roman civilization could offer to cooperative populations. These construction projects employed both Roman craftsmen and local workers, creating economic opportunities while transferring technical knowledge that enhanced Gallic capabilities in architecture, engineering, and urban planning. The road construction program that connected Gallic communities with broader Roman transportation networks represented perhaps the most visible and economically significant aspect of the Romanization process. Roman engineers surveyed and constructed hundreds of miles of paved roads that linked major settlements while providing reliable routes for military movements, commercial transportation, and administrative communications. These roads incorporated sophisticated engineering features including stone foundations, drainage systems, and carefully graded surfaces that remained passable during adverse weather conditions that had historically isolated communities during winter months. Way stations positioned at regular intervals provided accommodations for official travellers, while serving as collection points for tribute payments and administrative correspondence. The gradual integration of Gallic elites into Roman administrative and military structures created new pathways for social advancement, while ensuring that traditional aristocratic families maintained their influence under Roman oversight. Young Gallic nobles received education in Roman schools, where they learned Latin language and literature, alongside Roman political concepts and administrative techniques that would qualify them for positions within the expanding provincial bureaucracy. Military service in Roman auxiliary units provided additional opportunities for advancement, allowing Gallic warriors to demonstrate their loyalty while acquiring the citizenship rights that would integrate their families into the broader Roman social hierarchy. The transformation of Gallic military traditions reflected broader changes in social organisation as tribal warrior bands were gradually replaced by Roman-style units that served broader strategic objectives rather than local tribal interests. Former Celtic warriors found employment in Roman auxiliary forces, where their traditional fighting skills could be adapted to Roman tactical requirements, while their intimate knowledge of local terrain and conditions enhanced Roman military capabilities throughout the region. This integration process required careful management to prevent the formation of purely Gallic units that might serve as focal points for renewed resistance, while ensuring that traditional martial values were channeled into service supporting Roman strategic objectives. The economic transformation of conquered territories generated unprecedented wealth that flowed steadily towards Rome, while fundamentally altering the material conditions of life throughout Gaul. The systematic exploitation of Gallic resources began with comprehensive surveys that catalogued agricultural potential, mineral deposits, and human populations that could be taxed or conscripted for Roman purposes. Agricultural production was reorganised to emphasise crops and livestock that could support Roman military operations while generating surpluses for export to Mediterranean markets, where Gallic products commanded favourable prices. The introduction of Roman agricultural techniques and tools increased productivity while creating dependencies on Roman supply networks for essential equipment and materials. The slave trade that followed the Gallic conquest represented one of the most lucrative and morally devastating aspects of Roman economic exploitation. Caesar's own accounts suggest that over 1 million Gauls were enslaved during the 8 years of conquest, generating enormous profits for Roman slave dealers while providing labour for agricultural estates, mining operations and construction projects throughout the Roman world. The systematic enslavement of entire communities served both economic and political purposes, removing potential sources of future resistance while demonstrating the consequences of opposing Roman authority. Slave markets in Rome and other major cities were flooded with Gallic captives whose skills in metalworking, agriculture and crafts made them particularly valuable commodities in Mediterranean commercial networks. Tribute systems established throughout Gaul created regular revenue streams that financed both local administrative costs and Caesar's broader political ambitions in Rome. Each tribal territory was assessed tribute obligations based on population, agricultural productivity, and strategic importance, with payments required in combinations of grain, livestock, precious metals, and manufactured goods that could be readily converted to cash or used directly for military purposes. The collection of tribute required sophisticated administrative apparatus, including record-keeping systems, transportation networks, and enforcement mechanisms that gradually extended Roman bureaucratic control into every aspect of Gallic economic life. The establishment of Roman commercial networks throughout Gaul created new opportunities for trade while integrating former tribal economies into Mediterranean commercial systems that had previously remained largely inaccessible to Celtic producers. Roman merchants established permanent trading posts in major settlements where they exchanged Mediterranean luxury goods, wines, and manufactured products for Gallic metalwork, agricultural surpluses, and raw materials that were in high demand throughout the Roman world. These commercial relationships created economic dependencies that reinforced political control while providing incentives for cooperation with Roman administrative requirements. Mining operations throughout Gaul expanded dramatically under Roman supervision, employing both free labourers and slaves to extract gold, silver, iron, and other valuable materials that contributed substantially to Roman wealth while supporting local economic development. Roman mining techniques and equipment increased extraction efficiency while opening previously inaccessible deposits that had been beyond the capabilities of traditional Celtic mining methods. The profits from these operations were shared between Roman investors and local communities according to arrangements that provided incentives for cooperation, while ensuring that the majority of benefits flowed toward Roman interests. The long-term historical consequences of the Gallic Wars extended far beyond the immediate territorial and economic gains to encompass fundamental changes in the balance of power throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Caesar's military successes provided him with the wealth, veteran loyalty, and political prestige necessary to challenge the established order in Rome, leading directly to the civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic and establish the imperial system that would dominate European politics for centuries. The enormous quantities of gold and silver extracted from Gallic territories financed Caesar's political campaigns, while his veteran legions provided the military foundation for his eventual dictatorship. The permanent expansion of Roman civilization into temperate European regions established precedents and administrative models that would guide future Roman conquests, while demonstrating that Mediterranean political and cultural systems could be successfully adapted to diverse geographical and climatic conditions. The integration of Gallic populations into Roman society created hybrid communities that combined Celtic and Roman cultural elements, producing distinctive regional variations of Roman civilization that would persist long after the collapse of central imperial authority. These cultural syntheses would prove particularly significant during the medieval period, when former Roman territories developed into the kingdoms and principalities that would shape European political development for over a millennium. The Gallic Wars also established the Rhine as a crucial frontier that would define the limits of Roman expansion, while creating ongoing tensions with Germanic peoples who remained beyond Roman control. The systematic devastation of territories between the Rhine and Roman-controlled regions created buffer zones that provided security for Romanized populations, while establishing clear boundaries between Roman and Germanic spheres of influence. These frontier arrangements would prove remarkably durable, influencing European political geography well into the modern period, while creating cultural and linguistic boundaries that continue to affect European development today. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the Roman conquest of Gaul combined Celtic artistic traditions, religious practices, and social customs with Roman legal concepts, architectural styles, and administrative techniques to create distinctive regional cultures that would profoundly influence medieval European development. Celtic artistic motifs were incorporated into Roman decorative schemes, while traditional Gallic religious practices were adapted to Roman theological frameworks, creating syncretic belief systems that preserved important aspects of pre-conquest culture while accepting Roman political authority. The survival of Celtic languages alongside Latin created bilingual communities where cultural transmission continued through oral traditions, even as written communication increasingly employed Roman linguistic and literary forms. The educational systems established throughout Romanized Gaul created generations of bilingual, bicultural elites who served as intermediaries between Roman administrative requirements and local community needs while preserving selected aspects of traditional Celtic knowledge and customs. These educated classes would prove crucial during the later imperial period, when central Roman authority weakened, providing leadership for regional communities that maintained Roman legal and administrative traditions while adapting them to local conditions and requirements. Their cultural flexibility and administrative competence would enable former Gallic territories to maintain relatively stable political structures during the transition from Roman rule to medieval kingdoms. The military traditions established during the conquest period created lasting institutional frameworks that would influence European warfare for centuries after the collapse of Roman political authority. The integration of Celtic warriors into Roman military structures produced hybrid fighting forces that combined Roman tactical discipline with Celtic individual combat skills and intimate knowledge of European terrain and conditions. These military traditions would prove particularly significant during the medieval period, when former Roman territories developed distinctive military cultures that reflected both Roman organisational principles and Celtic warrior values. The Gallic Wars thus represented far more than a simple territorial conquest, constituting instead a fundamental transformation that reshaped the political, cultural, and economic landscape of Western Europe while establishing institutional and cultural foundations that would influence European development for over 1,500 years. Caesar's systematic destruction of Celtic political independence eliminated traditional tribal structures while creating opportunities for new forms of social organisation that combined Roman administrative efficiency with Celtic cultural resilience. The wealth extracted from Gaul financed the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire while providing the economic foundation for continued expansion that would eventually encompass most of the known European world. The legacy of these 8 years of conquest would echo through subsequent centuries as the Romanized populations of Gaul became integral components of the imperial system while maintaining distinctive regional identities that preserved important aspects of their Celtic heritage. The political institutions, legal traditions, urban centres, and commercial networks established during the conquest period provided frameworks for social organisation that would survive the collapse of central Roman authority, while adapting to new political conditions during the medieval period. The cultural synthesis achieved through the integration of Celtic and Roman traditions would profoundly influence the development of medieval European civilization, creating distinctive regional cultures that combined classical learning with Germanic political structures and Christian religious traditions to produce the complex cultural landscape that would define European identity for centuries to come.